2. What befalls fair Isolde after her father has gone 273. Fair Isolde escapes and disguises herself 278. 4. Fertram falls under a spell and is betrothed to Dark Isolde 281. The spell is broken, and the wicked queen's designs are frustrated 285. Prince Halanine 291. Fertram and Hildur 33. Icelandic fairy tales. The legend of the king's 3 sons. In olden days there once lived a king and a queen. They were wise and good, and their kingdom was known far and near as the happiest and best governed country in the world. They had 3 sons, Osric, Edric, and Frithiof, all handsome and brave and greatly beloved by their parents, but, having no daughter, the king had adopted his little orphan niece Isolde. She grew up with his sons and was their best-loved playfellow, both the king and queen making no distinction between her and their own children. As the princess grew older, she also grew fairer, till when she was 16 years old there was no maiden in the land so beautiful and sweet as Isolde. All 3 brothers fell in love with her and wanted to marry her, each in turn asking his father for her hand in marriage. Now the king was greatly puzzled what to do, for he loved his sons all equally well, so at length he decided that the princess should choose for herself and select the one she liked best. He therefore sent for her and told her that she was herself to choose as a husband whichever of his sons she liked best. "It is my duty as well as my pleasure to obey you, dear father," said Isolde, "but when you tell me to choose one of the princes as my husband, you give me a very difficult task, for they are all equally dear to me." When the king heard these words, he saw that his troubles were by no means at an end, so he thought for a long time how he could best find a way that would satisfy all parties, and at last decided to send all 3 sons away for a year. At the end of that time they were to return, and whoever had succeeded in bringing back the most precious and valuable thing from his travels should receive the hand of Isolde as his reward. The 3 princes were quite willing to accept these terms, and arranged among themselves that at the end of the year they would all meet at their hunting lodge, and thence go together to the king's palace with their gifts. So, bidding farewell to their parents and Isolde, they started off on their different journeys. Osric, the eldest son, traveled from city to city and explored various foreign countries without finding anything precious enough to take home. At last, when he had almost given up all hope, he heard that, not very far from where he then was, there lived a princess who possessed a wonderful telescope which was so powerful that one could see all over the world with it. No country was too distant, and not only could one see every town, but also every house and tree, and even people and animals inside the houses. Surely, thought Osric, no one could find a more precious or valuable thing than this glass, for nothing is hidden from it. So, having arrived at the castle where the princess dwelt, he told her the object of his journey, and asked whether she would sell him her telescope. At first the princess said she would not part with it, but when Osric told her how much depended on his taking back so valuable a gift, she consented to let him have it for a very large sum of money. The prince did not mind this. He only thought the gold well spent, and hastened homewards, full of hope that he would secure the hand of Isolde. Prince Edric fared much the same as his elder brother. He also traveled about in distant countries, seeking in vain for something rare and precious to bring home. At last, when the year was nearly at an end, he reached a large and populous town, and in the inn where he lodged he met a man who told him that in a cave outside the town there lived a curious little dwarf called Voland, who was famed for his rare skill in all kinds of metalwork. "Perhaps," thought the prince, "he might be able to make me some rare and costly article worthy to take back." So he went to the dwarf, but when he told him what he wanted, the dwarf said he was very sorry, but he had quite given up working in metals. "The last thing I made was a shield," he continued, but that is many years ago now. I made it for myself, and am unwilling to part with it, for not only is it almost the finest bit of work I ever did, but it has also some very special properties." "And what are these special properties?" asked the prince. "Well," replied the dwarf, "it is not only a perfect safeguard in battle, as no ordinary sword or arrow can pierce it, but if you sit on it, it will carry you all over the world, through the air as well as across the water. But there are some old runes or ancient letters carved on the shield which he who guides it must be able to read. But I will show it you." So saying, he went to the back of the cave and brought forth a beautiful shield, worked in gold, silver, and copper, the runic letters being all formed of precious stones. When Edric saw the shield and heard of its wonderful properties, he thought it would not be possible to find anything more rare or valuable. He therefore told the dwarf how much depended on his bringing back so precious a gift, and entreated him to let him purchase it. And he was so importunate and urged him so strongly that, although loth to part with it when the dwarf heard how much depended on his securing so rare a gift, he agreed to sell it him for a large sum of money. He also taught him how to read the runes, and Edric, thanking him for consenting to part with his shield, started on his homeward journey, filled with hope and confidence that he must win the princess's hand. Frithiof, the youngest son, was the last to start. He determined to travel through his own country first, so he wandered about from place to place, stopping in this town and that village, and wherever he met a merchant or hoped to find anything rare or beautiful, he made most searching inquiries. All his efforts, however, proved fruitless. The greater part of the year had already passed, and he was still as far as ever from his goal, and he almost began to fear that no success would crown his efforts. At length he arrived at a large and populous town, where a big market was being held, and numbers of people from all parts of the world came thronging in, some to buy and some to sell. So he followed the crowd, and then went on from stall to stall, and from one merchant to another, inspecting their wares and chatting and asking for news. But though there were many beautiful and many curious things, nothing specially struck his fancy. At length, tired and thirsty, he sat down beside a large fruit stall. The merchant, seeing, as he thought, a likely customer, came forward asking if he would not buy something, offering him grapes, peaches, pineapples, and melons in turn. But Frithiof shook his head. None of these tempted him, for on the very top shelf he saw a magnificent crimson apple, streaked with green and gold, lying on a bed of soft moss. "I should like that apple," said the prince, "and do not mind what I pay for it. It is the only thing that I fancy, though all your fruit is splendid." The merchant smiled but shook his head. "You have a quick eye," he said to the prince, "for that apple is indeed the rarest and most valuable thing I have, but it is not for sale. It was given to one of my ancestors who was a great doctor by a genie, and has the peculiar power that if it is placed in the right hand of anyone who is sick, no matter how dangerous the illness, they recover at once, aye, even if they are at the point of death, and many a life it has saved." When the prince heard this, he wished more than ever to possess the apple. He felt he could not possibly find anything that the princess, who was so kind-hearted, would value more than the possession of this apple, which would enable her to do good to others. He therefore entreated the merchant to let him buy the apple, and when the man had heard his tale, and all that depended upon his bringing back such a rare and precious gift, he sold the apple to the prince, who, filled with hope, now wended his way homewards. And so it happened that, as they had arranged, the three brothers arrived at the hunting lodge, outside the capital, and after they had related their adventures, Osric, the eldest, said, "Now let us hasten to the palace, but before starting I should like to see what the princess is doing." He thereupon drew forth his telescope and looked in the direction of the palace, but no sooner had he done so than an exclamation of terror escaped his lips, for there on her couch lay the princess, white and still as the driven snow, while beside her stood the king and queen and the chief of the courtiers in a sorrowful group, sadly awaiting the last breath of the fair Isolde. When Osric beheld this grievous sight, he was overwhelmed with grief, and when his brothers heard what he had seen, they too were overcome with sorrow. Gladly would each have given all they possessed to be back in time, at least to bid her farewell. Then Prince Edric remembered his magic shield, which would at once carry them to the king's palace, and, bringing it forth, the three brothers seated themselves on it, and the shield rose up in the air, and in a few seconds they had reached the palace, and hastened up to the princess's chamber, where they found all the court assembled, sadly awaiting the end. Then Frithiof remembered his apple. Now was the time to test its power. Stepping softly up to the couch, he bent over the still white form of the princess and gently placed the apple in her right hand. Immediately a change was visible. It seemed as if a fresh stream of life passed through her body. The color returned to her lips and cheeks. She opened her eyes, and after a few minutes she was able to sit up and speak. The general rejoicing at the princess's wonderful and unexpected recovery, and at the happy and opportune return of the three princes, can be better imagined than described. But as soon as she was quite well, the king, mindful of his promise, called together a great thing, or national assembly, at which the brothers were to exhibit the treasures they had brought back, when judgment would be pronounced. Handed round for the people to see, while he explained its strange and marvelous properties, stating how by means of this glass he had saved the princess, for he had been able to see how ill she was. He therefore considered that he had earned the right to claim the princess's hand. Then Edric, the second brother, stepped forth and showed the beautiful shield he had got from the dwarf, and explained its peculiar power. "Of what use would have been my brother's glass," he asked, "without this shield, which carried us hither in time to save her life? I claim, therefore, that it was really due to the power of my shield that the princess is not dead, and that I ought therefore to possess her hand in marriage." And now it was Frithiof's turn to come forward with the apple. He said, "I fear that neither the telescope which first showed us that the princess was ill, nor the shield which so quickly brought us hither, would have sufficed to restore the Princess Isolde to life and health, had it not been for the magic power of my apple. For what good could our mere presence have done her? Our seeing her thus and unable to help her would only have added to our grief and pain. It is due to my apple that the princess has been restored to us, and I therefore think my claim to her hand is the greatest." Then there arose much questioning and reasoning in the thing as to which of the three articles were of the greatest value, but as they could come to no satisfactory agreement, the judges declared that all three articles were of equal value, for they had all equally contributed to restore the princess to life and health, for if one had been missing, the other two would have been valueless. So judgment was pronounced that, all three gifts being equally valuable, neither of the brothers could claim the princess's hand. Then the king happily hit upon the idea of allowing his sons to shoot for the prize, and whoever was adjudged the best shot should wed the princess. So a target was set up, and Osric, armed with bow and arrow, stepped forth first. Taking careful aim, he drew his bow, and the arrow sped forth, but it fell some distance short of the mark. Then Edric stepped forth. He too took careful aim, and his arrow fell nearer the mark. And now it was Frithiof's turn. He too took a very careful aim, and all the people said his arrow went beyond the mark, and that he was the best shot, but when they came to look for it, behold, it could nowhere be found. In vain search was made in all directions. No sign of the arrow could be found. The king therefore decided that Edric had won the princess's hand. The wedding forthwith took place amid great splendor and rejoicing, and the princess and her husband then went to her own country, where they reigned long and happily. The eldest brother Osric, greatly vexed that he had not been successful, started off on a long journey, and nothing more was heard of him. So only the youngest brother was left at home. But he was not at all satisfied with the way matters had turned out, for he had always been considered by far the best shot. He therefore searched every day in the field where the trial had taken place, looking for his arrow. At length, after many days, he found it lodged in an oak tree, far beyond the mark. He brought witnesses to attest the truth of this, and though there could be no question that his arrow had gone the furthest, the king said it was now too late to go into the matter, for the princess was married and gone away. Then Frithiof grew very restless. He thought he had been unfairly treated, and at length decided to go away, so he packed up his belongings and, bidding his parents farewell, started off in search of adventures. After passing along the wide plains that surrounded the capital, he climbed a high range of mountains, and from thence descended into a great forest. Here he wandered about for several days, but whichever way he turned he could see nothing but trees all around him. The small store of food he had taken with him when he started was exhausted, and tired, hungry, and footsore, he sat down to rest on a large, flat, gray stone, unable to proceed any further. He thought the end of his days had surely come, when suddenly he heard the noise of horses' feet, and looking up he saw 10 men mounted on horseback coming rapidly towards him. They were all richly dressed and well armed, the last one leading a finely caparisoned palfrey. When they came to the prince, the leader dismounted and, bowing low before him, begged him to honor them by mounting the steed they had brought with them. Frithiof gratefully accepted this offer, and, mounting the horse, the party turned back the way they had come, riding rapidly on till they arrived at a large town. Before entering the gates they dismounted, the prince alone remaining on horseback, and then led the prince in state to the palace. Now it happened that a most beautiful young queen reigned over this province. She had been left an orphan at an early age, her father entrusting his chief ministers with the care and responsibility of looking after her and finding her a worthy husband. Queen Hildegard received the prince with much friendliness. She told him that her fairy godmother had bestowed on her the gift of seeing, whenever she wished, what happened in other countries. A wandering minstrel came here and told us of the wonderful journeys you and your brothers had made, and also of your sorrow at your failure in the shooting competition for the Princess Isolde's hand, though you were the best shot of the 3. Then a great wish seized me to try and make you happy, so I followed your wanderings after you left your father's palace, and when I saw you, sad and tired, resting on the great stone in my forest, I sent forth some of my knights to meet you and bring you back, and now, with the consent of my ministers, I invite you to remain here as my husband. You shall rule over my kingdom, and I will try, as far as lies in my power, to make you forget all the trouble and anxiety you have gone through." Frithiof was charmed with the beauty and kindness of the maiden, and gladly consented to share her throne, and very happy days followed for both of them. The wedding was on the most magnificent scale, and after they were married, Frithiof, according to the custom of the country, took the reins of government in his hands amid the general rejoicing of the people. And now we must return to the old king. Soon after his youngest son had gone away, the queen died, and the king, well advanced in years, felt very lonely and dull. One day, while seated beside the great open hearth in the big audience hall, a peddler woman entered and displayed her wares before him. She told him her name was Brunhilde. She had evidently traveled much, and amused the king with tales of where she had been and what she had seen. When she was going away, the king told her she might come again, which she did day after day, till the king got so interested in her talk that he never was happy unless Brunhilde was with him, and at length he asked her to marry him and be his queen. In vain the chief ministers and courtiers dissuaded him from taking this step. The king was determined, and the wedding took place. No sooner had Brunhilde gained her object than she showed that she meant to be a real queen, not merely one in name. She always sat beside the king in council and interfered in all state matters. He would do nothing without consulting her, and no matter how wrong or unfair it might be, he always did whatever she wished. One day she said to him, "It seems very strange to me that you have never made any attempt to recall your son who went away. Why, only the other day we heard that he had become king of a neighboring country. You may depend upon it that, as soon as he has got a sufficiently large army, he will come back and attack you here, in order to revenge himself for the fancied wrong he imagines was done him in the trial of skill for the princess's hand. Now take my advice. Call out your army, attack him first, and so ward off the danger that threatens your country." At first the king would not listen to what the queen said, and declared she was only frightening herself for nothing. But Brunhilde brought forward fresh arguments each day, till at length the king thought she must be right, and asked her what he had better do, so that the prince should not suspect anything. "You must first send messengers to him with presents," said the queen, "and invite him to come and see you, so that you may arrange with him about his succession to the throne after your death, and also to strengthen the friendship and neighborly relations between your two countries. After that we will consult further." The king thought her advice very good, and at once sent messengers laden with presents to his son. When they arrived at Prince Frithjof's court, they told the young king how anxious his father was to see him, and hoped he would make no long tarrying in coming to visit him. Frithjof, greatly pleased with the handsome gifts his father had sent him, at once agreed to go, and hastened to make all preparations for his journey. But when Queen Hildegard heard of it, she became very anxious and entreated her husband not to leave her. "I feel that some danger threatens you, and that you may even lose your life," she said. But Frithjof laughed at her fears. "Surely you do not think my father would entreat me to come to him if he meant to deal wrongly with me? No, no, dear wife, set your heart at rest and have no fears. I will make but a short stay." And so saying, he bade her a fond farewell, and started off with the messengers, arriving after a short journey at his father's court. But instead of the warm greeting promised him, to his surprise the king received him but coldly, and began to reproach him for being so undutiful as to go away. "It was most unfilial behavior," broke in the queen, "and caused such grief to your father that he was nearly at death's door, and had anything happened to him, your life would have been forfeited according to the laws of the land. As, however, you have given yourself up willingly and have come here when he sent for you, he will not condemn you to death, but he gives you 3 tasks to perform, which you must accomplish within the year." It was in vain that Frithjof declared he never meant to vex his father. The queen would not let the old king speak, and said the only way Frithjof could save his life was to carry out the tasks his father had set him, which were as follows. "First, you must bring back a tent large enough to seat 100 knights, and yet so fine and thin that you can cover it with one hand, sicknesses, and, thirdly, you must show me a man who is utterly unlike any other man in the whole world." "And in what direction must I go to find these rarities?" asked Frithjof. "Nay, that is your affair," said the king, when Brunhilde, taking his arm, led him away into his own chamber, and Frithjof, without other farewell, sorrowfully returned to his own kingdom. On his arrival, Queen Hildegard hastened down to meet him, and seeing him looking sad and silent, asked him anxiously how he had fared at his father's court. At first Frithjof, not liking to frighten her, tried to put her off, and made light of the scant courtesy shown him, but Hildegard, kneeling down beside him and taking his hand in hers, entreated him to conceal nothing from her. "I know you have had some difficult tasks given you, which will not be easy to perform, but do not lose heart, dear husband. Tell me all, and then we will see if some way cannot be found to carry them out. A thing bravely faced is half accomplished, and it is not at all impossible that with my kind godmother's help I may be able to aid you. Tell me therefore what makes you so anxious." Then Frithiof, taking heart, told Hildegard of the difficult tasks that the queen had given him to do. "And if I fail to accomplish them within the year, I must forfeit my life," he concluded. "This is surely your stepmother's doing," said Hildegard. "She is a jealous and, I fear also, a wicked woman. Let us hope she is not planning any further mischief against you. She evidently thought these tasks she gave you would be more than you could accomplish, but, fortunately, I can help you in some of them. The tent your father wants I happen to have. It was given me by my godmother, so that difficulty is disposed of. Then the magic water which you are to bring is not far from here. Nevertheless, it is not easy to get, for it is in a deep well inside a dark cave which is guarded by 7 lions and 3 huge snakes. Several persons have tried to get in and fetch some of the water, but no one has ever yet come back alive. I might give you some poison to kill these monsters, but unfortunately, the water loses all its healing power if it is taken after the animals are dead. But I think I may nevertheless be able to help you to get it." Queen Hildegard then sent for her cowherd, and he and his 2 assistants drove 7 oxen and 3 great boars to the mouth of the cave. Here the animals were killed, and the carcasses thrown down before the lions and snakes. Then, while the monsters were gorging themselves with the carcasses of the dead animals, the queen told Frithiof to lower her quickly down the well. She had provided herself with a large crystal jar. This she immediately filled with the water, and when Frithiof drew her up again, so exactly had she timed it that they both reached the mouth of the cave just as the lions and snakes were finishing the last morsels of their meal. Thus the second task was safely accomplished, and Frithiof and Hildegard hastened back to the palace. "The 2 first tasks are happily ended," said Hildegard, "but the third and most difficult one still remains to be done, and this you must carry out by yourself. All I can do is to tell you how best to set to work about it. You must know that I have a half-brother called Randur. He lives on an island not very far from here. He is 9 feet high, has 1 big eye in the middle of his forehead, and a black beard 30 yards long and as hard and stiff as pig's bristles. He also has a daub's snout instead of a mouth and nose, and a pair of green cat's eyes. In truth, it would be impossible to find another creature like him. When he wants to go from one place to another, he swings himself along by means of a great pole 50 yards long, and in this way he almost seems to fly through the air like a bird. The island on which he lives forms about 1/3 of my father's kingdom, and my brother thought he ought to have had a larger share. Then, also, my father had a wonderful ring which my brother wished to keep, but this also fell to my share, and since then my brother has shut himself up in his island. Now, however, I will write to him, enclosing the ring he always coveted. Perhaps that may dispose him to be more friendly to us, and we may get him to go to the king's court, for I know no one else who could so well fulfill the third task given you. Now, therefore, you must go to him, accompanied by a large following of knights and squires, for that will please him. When you come near his castle, take off your crown and approach his throne bareheaded. He will then stretch forth his hand, and you must bend your knee and kiss it, and then hand him my letter and the ring. If after reading it he tells you to rise and seat yourself beside him, we may hope that he will aid us. And now, good luck attend you." Frithiof followed the queen's instructions exactly. When he arrived at the three-eyed king's palace, both he and his attendants were greatly startled at the frightful ugliness of the three-eyed monarch, but quickly recovering himself, Frithiof handed him Hildegard's letter and the ring. When the giant saw the ring, he seemed greatly pleased and said, "I suppose my sister wants my help in some important matter, that she sends me so valuable a present." He then bade Frithiof sit down beside him, and, having read his sister's letter, he said he was quite ready to help and carry out her wishes. He then stretched out his hand, grasped the long pole that always rested near him, and in an instant he had swung himself out of sight. The king feared at first that Randor had gone away altogether and left them, but a loud shout told them he had only gone in advance. And thus they went on, the giant waiting for them every now and then, and when they reached him scolding them well for being so slow and dilatory. In this way they at last arrived at the queen's palace, and Randor at once asked Hildegard what it was she wanted him to do. The queen then told him what Frithiof's father had required of her husband, and begged her brother to accompany Frithiof back to his father's court. Randor, greatly pleased at having at last got the ring he so much coveted, declared himself quite ready to do as she desired. So they started off at once for the old king's palace, which they reached without any further adventures. Frithiof announced his arrival to his father, but though he informed him that he had obtained the 3 things required of him a year ago, he carefully kept Randor in safe hiding till his presence should be required, and asked that a thing might be called together in order that he might show the people how he had succeeded in carrying out the tasks assigned him. So the old king issued a proclamation all through the land, and on the appointed day so great was the interest and curiosity of everyone, from the king and his courtiers down to the very poorest laborer and herd boy, that there was hardly standing room in all the great Thing Valley. Queen Brunhilde was furious at the thought that Frithiof should have been successful, but she still hoped that, when the things were brought to light, it would be found that he had failed in something. The tent was produced first. When it was fairly set up, it was so large and roomy that 100 knights and squires easily found room inside, yet it was so finely wrought that when closed anyone could cover it with their hand. So all the people declared Prince Frithiof had fully acquitted himself of his first task. Then the prince brought forth the crystal jar with the healing water and handed it to his father. Queen Brunhilde, who was getting quite yellow with anger, insisted upon tasting it to see whether it was the right water and taken at the right time, so as not to lose its healing qualities. But as she was quite well, no sooner had she tasted the healing water than she felt very ill and had to take a second taste ere she was well again. So the second task was pronounced to have also been successfully accomplished. "Now," said the king, "there only remains the third and last task, and that was the most difficult one. See that you have not failed in that." Then Frithiof sent for the 3-eyed giant whom he had kept in safe hiding till now. When Randor appeared before the Thing, springing into their midst by means of his long pole, everyone, but especially the old king, started back in fear. They could not imagine how he had got there, and thought he must have flown down from the skies. Never before had they seen so hideous a creature. But, not taking any notice of the crowd, Randor walked up to the queen, and placing the point of his long pole against her chest, he raised her up in the air, and then hurled her to the ground, when she fell down dead, and was immediately transformed into the hideous old giantess she really was. Having accomplished this, Randor made his way out of the Thing, and returned to his island. Frithiof devoted all his efforts to restore and nurse the old king, who, through anxiety and fright, had nearly been at death's door. But a few drops of the healing water sprinkled over him quickly restored him, and being freed by the queen's death from all her wicked enchantments, he speedily recovered his former good sense, and found that all the faults he had thought his son guilty of were only the inventions of wicked Queen Brunhilde. He therefore called Frithiof to his bedside, and begged him to forgive him all the injury he had tried to do him. "I am only anxious now to make up to you, my dear son, for all you have suffered, and beg you never to leave me again." I will gladly hand over the kingdom to you and live beside you in peace and quiet for the rest of my days." So Frithiof was reconciled to his father, and at once sent messengers to Hildegard telling her what had happened and begging her to hasten to him. Queen Hildegard, when she received her husband's message, decided to give up her small kingdom to her brother as a reward for all he had done for them, and then, accompanied by some of her husband's ablest courtiers and friends, she rejoined Frithiof, and the old king, happy at having his son again, lived to a good old age, surrounded by his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Helga. An old man and his wife once lived in a cottage beside the sea, far away from any other habitations. They had 3 daughters. The eldest was called Fredegond, the second Olga, and the youngest Helga. Now, although the parents were not rich, owning only a few acres of land which they tilled themselves, Fredegond and Olga were treated as if they were princesses. They never did any work, but sat all day amusing themselves and decking themselves in any finery their father brought them home from the neighboring town, whilst Helga, who was far more beautiful and clever than either of her sisters, was always kept in the background. She never shared in any pleasures that her elder sisters often enjoyed. No presents were ever brought home for her, but all day long, from early morning till late at night, poor Helga had to work and toil for the whole family, receiving nothing but sour looks, often accompanied by blows from the elder sisters. Now, it happened one day that the fire on their hearth had been allowed to go out. Helga was busy working in the fields, and as they had to send a long way to fetch fresh fire, the old man told Fredegond she must go for it. At first Fredegond grumbled, for she was trying to dress her hair in a new way, but then she thought a walk through the woods might be pleasant, so she started. After she had gone some little distance, she came to a hillock, and heard a deep voice saying, "Would you rather have me with you, or against you?" Fredegond, thinking it was some laborer or woodcutter, said she did not care in the least, and that it was very impertinent of him to address her, and went on to the cave whence they fetched their fire. When she got there, to her great surprise she saw a big cauldron filled with meat boiling on the fire, and beside it stood a pan filled with dough waiting to be made into cakes, but not a creature in sight. Fredegond, being very hungry after her long walk, stirred up the fire beneath the cauldron to make the meat boil quickly, and then began baking some cakes. But although she made one specially nice for herself, she let all the others burn, so that they were quite uneatable. Then, as soon as the meat was cooked, she took a bowl from a shelf, filled it with all the best bits, and sat down and made a good meal, finishing up with the cake. Just as she had finished, a big black dog ran up to her, and began wagging his tail and begging for some food. But Fredegond angrily gave him a slap and chased him away. Then the dog grew angry, and, jumping upon her, bit one of her hands. Screaming with fright and pain, Fredegond jumped up and, in her hurry to get away, forgot all about the fire she was to bring, and ran home to tell her parents what had happened. They were very sorry, both for her sore hand, which they bathed and bandaged, and the lack of the fire. It was really very unfortunate, for that cave was the nearest place where they could procure some fire, as it was generally used by charcoal burners. So, though very unwilling to send Olga, who was their pet and favorite, she had to go, for they all feared that if Helga were sent, she might run away and never come back again. And then there would be no one on whom to vent their bad tempers, or to do the work of the whole household, for did she not wait on father and mother and both her sisters? So it was decided that Olga should go. But, alas, Olga fared even worse than her sister. She was so spoilt that she thought she ought always to have the best of everything. So, when she reached the cave, she too helped herself to all the best bits of meat, and, making a nice cake for herself, threw the rest of the dough on the fire. Then when the dog came up to her and wagged his tail and sat up and begged for some food, Olga took up some of the boiling broth and threw it on him. This made the dog so angry that he jumped up and bit off the point of her nose, and Olga ran home crying and screaming, with only half a nose and no fire. This time the parents were quite beside themselves with anger and decided that Helga must go and fetch the fire. If she succeeded, well and good, and if not, why, the dog might eat her for all they cared. It would be a good riddance. So, taking up the big fire shovel, Helga went on her way to the cave. As she passed the hillock, she too heard a voice saying, "Would you rather I was with you than against you?" To this question she answered, "A well-known proverb says, 'There is nothing so bad that it is not better to have it on your side than against you.' So, as I do not know who you are who asked me this question, I would rather that you were with me than against me." And hearing nothing further and seeing no one, Helga continued her way till she reached the cave. Here she found everything the same as her sisters had done. The cauldron was on the fire, and the dough was ready for baking, but instead of thinking only of herself, Helga looked after the meat and saw that it was nicely cooked. Then, with great care, she made up the dough into cakes, and never thought of taking anything for herself, although she was very hungry, for she had had nothing for her breakfast but some hard, dry crusts and a glass of cold water. Neither would she now help herself to any of the fire without asking leave from the owner of the cave. Feeling very tired after her long walk, Helga sat down on a bench to rest. But she had hardly done so when she heard a loud rumbling noise. The ground began to tremble, and Helga, fearful that the cave might fall in, rose hastily from her seat. But as she turned to run out, she saw a big, three-headed giant standing at the entrance of the cave, followed by a large black dog. Helga was terribly frightened, but being fond of animals, she held out her hand and patted the dog, and she quite regained courage when the giant, in a kind voice, said, "You have done the work well, which you found waiting here. It is only right, therefore, that you should get your share. Sit down, therefore, on that bench and share my dinner. Afterwards you can take home some of the fire you have come for." The giant then got a bowl from the shelf and helped Helga to some broth out of the big cauldron, carefully giving her the tenderest bits of meat. As he did so, the ground again began to shake and tremble, and fearful noises like claps of thunder frightened Helga greatly. But the giant, in a gentle voice, bade her sit down beside him, and she finished her broth. Then the giant got up and gave her one of the cakes she had baked, but no sooner had she finished it than the ground again began to shake and tremble, the thunder pealed, and flash after flash of lightning lit up the inside of the cave. Helga got so terrified that she ran up to the giant for protection, and as she clung to his arm the noises ceased, and as the darkness passed away, Helga saw that the giant had disappeared, and that she was holding on to the arm of a handsome young prince. "Nay, do not be frightened," he said. "I can never thank you enough, dear Helga, for you have rescued me from the horrible enchantment the wicked fairy Gondomar pronounced on me at my birth. I am Torquil, the son of King Osbert, who reigns in the neighboring island, but because my father refused to marry Gondomar and chose my mother instead, the wicked fairy condemned me to go through life a three-headed monster, until some young girl should, despite my frightful appearance, place full trust and confidence in me." As Prince Torquil said these words, he seated himself beside Helga on a stone thickly covered with soft green moss. Then Helga told him her history and why she came to the cave, and also the fate of her sisters who had gone to the cave on the same errand, adding that she must hasten back with the fire, else her father and mother would scold and beat her. "You shall not be ill-treated any more," replied Torquil, and he went to the back of the cave and presently returned carrying a casket and a small bundle in his hands. "See, this casket contains gold and pearls and precious stones," he said. "You can give some of these to your sisters, but this," and he placed the bundle on a stool, "you must wear under your own dress when you get home, and be very careful that no one sees it." So saying, he undid the bundle and unfolded a beautiful dress of cloth of gold, all worked with silver and precious stones. Helga could not repress a cry of admiration when she saw the lovely gown, and warmly thanked the prince for all his beautiful gifts. Torquil then filled her fire shovel with burning coals and carried it for her some part of the way home. But ere they came in sight of the cottage, he stopped and, taking her hand, placed a heavy gold ring on her finger. "Keep this ring, dear Helga," he said, "and let no one take it from you. It will not be long ere I come to claim my bride, but I must first return to my parents and tell them the joyful news that the wicked charm is broken at last." With these words he took a loving farewell of Helga and started her on her homeward journey. When she reached the cottage, and her parents saw that she had succeeded in bringing back the fire, Helga, for once in her life, received a kind word of welcome. But when she showed them the casket, and was about to give her sisters some of the jewels, they seized upon it, and dividing the contents among themselves, returned Helga the empty casket. They might also have taken away her beautiful dress, but after Torquil left her, she had taken the precaution to slip it on under her old gown, so no one knew anything about it. And thus some days passed on. Matters relapsed into their former way. Fredegond and Olga did nothing all day but deck themselves with the jewels out of the casket, quarreling and fighting over them, and Helga, as before, had to do the work for the whole family when one day the mother, who had been to the higher meadow for some herbs she wanted, came back and said that she had seen a beautiful big ship lying at anchor on the shore below their cottage. The old man hastened down to the strand to find out who the owner of the fine vessel might be, and seeing a boat pulling off from it, he waited till the stranger, who was a handsome young man, had landed, and then entered into conversation with him. But though he plied him with many questions, he could not find out his name. Then the young man in his turn began to question him, and asked him how many children he had. "Only 2 daughters," replied the old man, "and such good and beautiful girls they are, too," he added. "I should much like to see them," said the stranger. The old man, greatly delighted, led the way back to his cottage, where his 2 eldest daughters had hurried on their best frocks and decked themselves with all the jewels out of Helga's casket. The stranger expressed himself as being very pleased with the girls. "But," he asked, "why has one of your daughters got her hand tied up with a cloth, and the other one a handkerchief fastened across her nose?" At first the father said they had met with an accident and slipped down the cliffs, but when the stranger pressed for further particulars, the story of the dogs in the cave had to be told. "But surely you have another daughter," said the stranger, "one who, I know, is always kind to all animals." At first the old man and his wife both declared they only had those 2 daughters, but when the stranger kept on urging him, he at last admitted that he had another girl. "But she is so ugly, lazy, and wicked," he added, "that she is more like some wild animal than a human being." But the stranger said he did not mind that at all, and that he must see her. So the old man was obliged at last to call Helga. The poor girl came out from the kitchen dressed just as she was in her shabby old dress when the young man went up to her, and as he took her hand the ragged old gown slipped from her shoulders, and there, to the astonishment and rage of her sisters, stood Helga, arrayed in the beautiful garment the prince had given her. Prince Torquil rated the old man and the 2 wicked sisters soundly for all their unkindness to Helga. He also made the sisters give up all the jewels they had taken from her. But Helga begged that they might be allowed to keep a few, and the prince consenting, she gave each of them 2 chains, 2 brooches, 2 bracelets, and 2 pairs of earrings. Then Torquil led Helga down to the shore and took her on board his beautiful ship, where his sister gave her a kindly welcome. And when they reached his own country, King Osbert and his queen prepared a great wedding feast, and Torquil and Helga were married, and lived long and happily together. Thorstein, Chapter 1. How Thorstein Lost His Kingdom. There once reigned a king and queen a long, long time ago, who had an only child, a son called Thorstein. The lad was brave, strong, and handsome, and was greatly beloved by everyone on account of his kind-heartedness and open-handed generosity. But as years passed, and he attained to man's estate, His indiscriminating kindness was often taken advantage of. His father and mother tried to check him, pointing out that heedless generosity often did more harm than good. But Thorstein could not be brought to believe that kindness could ever be wrong or do harm, and continued to give to everyone who asked him, as long as he had anything he could part with. At length the king and queen died. On their deathbed they again endeavored to impress upon their son that a good and wise king must not only reign with kindness, but also with justice. But though Thorstein, who loved his parents dearly and was terribly grieved at the idea of losing them, promised he would do his best and bear their wise counsel in mind. No sooner were the burial ceremonies concluded and he was crowned king than all his good resolves to be firm and discriminating were scattered to the winds. He kept open house for all who chose to come, gave gifts to all who asked, so that all the riches and treasure his wise father had so carefully collected began very speedily to disappear, without anyone being really the better or happier for them. So quickly indeed did all he had inherited vanish, that ere many months had passed he had nothing left but the kingdom itself, and then realizing the truth that a penniless king has but small authority or power, he decided to part with his throne, and thus have some money wherewith to make a fresh start in life. There was no difficulty in finding a purchaser, and Thorstein, in exchange for a horse and a sack filled with gold and silver, parted with his inheritance. But when he had once sold his kingdom, his so-called friends, who had been so numerous before, now speedily began to drop off, and as the sack got emptier, so did his companions grow fewer in number. "There will soon be nothing more to be got out of him," they said. "A fool and his money is soon parted." So they gradually deserted him. Then, when it was too late, Thorstein began to realize the sad plight he had brought himself to, and determined to quit the country and leave his false friends behind him. He therefore put together the few things he had left, placed them on the horse he had bought, and mounting his own fine chestnut, which he could never bring himself to part with, he started off on his travels. For a long time Thorstein wandered on over desolate moors and through dark, somber forests, not knowing or caring where he went or what became of him. He had no friends, not a single creature to care for or who loved him, so he allowed the horses to roam where they listed, letting them graze whenever they came to any fresh grass, but beyond this never resting or pausing anywhere. Once, when they had stopped to graze near a tiny stream on the banks of which the grass looked specially fresh, he got off his horse, and throwing himself down on the ground, almost made up his mind to go no further. Why not rest there till death overtook him? But even as this thought flashed through him, he raised his eyes towards the west, where the sun was just setting in a bed of crimson and gold, flushing all the distant peaks of the great snow-capped mountains with magic rainbow hues. While still lost in wondering admiration at the gorgeous spectacle, the rosy clouds suddenly parted, and a star of exquisite brilliancy shot down a ray of light that seemed to touch Thorstein's face, and he heard a voice saying, "Fear not, Thorstein, but go forth on thy travels with a brave heart. Learn from the mistakes of thy youth that indiscriminate open-handedness is neither just nor kind, but only does harm, and that a true sovereign must also be a father to his people." And even as the voice died away, the rosy light gradually faded from sky and mountain, and the pale golden moon rose and shed its soft silvery radiance over earth and sky. Thorstein started to his feet. He felt the warm blood coursing quickly through his veins, and whistling to his horses, who came obedient to his call, he mounted his noble chestnut with a light heart, fully determined to seek his fortune. When the king returned in the evening from the chase, neither the queen nor Sigurd told him what had happened during his absence. The next morning he declared his intention of going out hunting in a still further part of the kingdom, and once more Ingebjorg tried to persuade the boy to go with his father. Her persuasions were useless. He was more than ever determined to stay with her, hoping in some unforeseen way that he might be of use, for that there was some dreadful mystery about the giantess, he was sure. This time, directly the king left, Ingiborg put the prince into a large press, and as she turned away, he saw tears in her eyes, and guessed that she feared some terrible new visitor. And he was right. Hardly had she closed the door when the noises of yesterday were renewed, the ground quaked, and a still greater giantess appeared, her feet buried in the floor up to her knees to allow of her entering the room. "A pleasant greeting to you, Sister Ingiborg," she cried. "Is Sigurd, the king's son, at home?" "No," said Ingiborg. "How should he be when the king, his father, is hunting far from the palace?" And as yesterday, she immediately began to spread the table with delicacies. When the meal was over, the giantess took her leave, saying, "I thank thee for the best food and most refreshing draught of ale that I have yet tasted. Is Sigurd, the king's son, at home?" Again Ingiborg said no, and in a few moments she was alone, and all was quiet. Then Sigurd came out of the press, and once more his mother clasped him in her arms, and he heard her say to herself, "My son, my son! If I can but save him once more, all may yet be well." With tears she entreated him, for her sake, to go away with his father the next day. "Twice I have hidden you successfully, but my third sister comes tomorrow, and she is sharper and fiercer than either of the others. If I can save you this time, they will never come again. My son, leave me this once. Even if they do me harm, I shall know that you are safe." "Mother," Sigurd answered, "I am no longer a little child. If you are in danger at all, my place is with you, and I am sure that your sister cannot do me any real harm." When Hans looked round, he was surprised to find himself in a fine large room, fitted up with every comfort. Great couches, spread with soft rugs, ran along two sides. In one corner was the hearth, on which a bright fire was burning, and on the other side was a table with some chairs beside it, and covered with various papers and quaint instruments. The old man put the child into a pretty little cot, and after he and Hans had partaken of some food, he invited the latter to rest. Hans, nothing loath, threw himself on one of the couches with his cat beside him, and, thoroughly tired out with all the excitement of his departure and the long distance he had walked, fell asleep almost as soon as his head rested on the pillow. But even in his sleep he heard the dwarf working at his papers during the greater part of the night. Next morning, after they had breakfasted and Hans was ready to start forth on his travels, the dwarf again thanked him for his timely rescue. "I can never be grateful enough to you for saving my child," he continued. "And now I am going to give you 3 things which I hope will be useful to you, though nothing can ever cancel my debt to you." "Indeed, you owe me but small thanks," replied Hans, laughing. "It was really my cat who saved your child, by killing the dragon ere I came up to him." But though Hans declared he wanted no payment, the dwarf would take no denial. "You see this small stone," he said. "It possesses the power of making whoever holds it in his hand invisible. This sword," he continued, drawing forth a tiny but exquisitely damascened sword, "is both sharp and strong, and though small enough to carry in your pocket, you have but to express the wish when you need to use it, and it will at once attain its full size and strength. And here," he added, "is my third gift. It is, as you see, but a tiny little ship, like a child's toy, so small that you can easily carry it also in your pocket, and yet, whenever you desire, it will become as large as you may need it, either to go on a river or across the sea, and it further possesses the property of being able to sail, no matter whether there is any wind or not." It was in vain that Hans protested he had in no way earned such valuable gifts. The dwarf insisted, so Hans was fain to take the precious treasures, thanking him most warmly for his great kindness. He then bade him farewell, kissed the pretty child who clung round his neck, and, taking up his iron crutch, shouldered his cat and departed. Chapter 2. His arrival at the giant's castle. For some time he followed the rough track across the open plain, but presently he arrived at a small farm. Knocking at the door, he asked the old man who opened it if he might rest the night there. "Oh, yes," replied the man. "If you don't mind taking things as you find them, you are very welcome." Thorstein thanked him kindly, and after stabling his horses in the shed at the back, threw himself down on the rushes that were lying in one corner of the room, the farm servants occupying the opposite corner, and the old man sleeping in a third corner, the remaining one being filled by the huge stove. Thorstein, tired out with his long day's journey, slept soundly all night, but when he woke next morning he was surprised to find the farmer and his men had already gone out. Fearing lest some treachery might be meditated, he sprang up from his bed and rushed out of the house. There, to his surprise, he saw the farmer and all his men busily at work with their pitchforks, digging and raking up the earth from a large tumulus or grave at some little distance from the farm. Thorstein hurried up to the farmer and asked him what he was doing and why he was disturbing the grave. "I have very good reason for doing so," replied the man. "The man who lies buried there owes me $200. "But," said Thorstein, "no amount of digging will give you back the money he owed you. On the contrary, you are losing your own time as well as that of your men, and you will probably, in addition, get fined for disturbing the grave." But the farmer was obstinate. He said he did not care. Only he was quite determined that the dead man should not rest peacefully in his grave, while he owed him all that money, and that he and his men would continue to dig and stir up the ground day after day. Then Thorstein asked him if he would be satisfied and let the man rest in his grave if someone else paid the dead man's debt. "Oh, yes," answered the farmer, "but I don't see where that man is likely to come from, as he had no sons." Then Thorstein drew forth his purse, which contained the last of his money, and gave it to the farmer in payment of the debt. The farmer thanked him warmly, and promised not to disturb the grave any more. So Thorstein bade his host farewell, but ere he left he asked him which road he should take, so as to reach a populous neighborhood where he might chance to get some work to do. "You must continue along this same road," replied the farmer, "until you come to 4 crossroads. Then don't take the road that goes east, but take the one that goes west." Thorstein thanked him and rode away. After some time he arrived at the crossroads, and took the road to the west, as the farmer had advised him. But he had not gone very far when he thought he would rather like to know why the man had said he should not go the other way. "Perhaps there are giants or some other dangers one may meet," thought Thorstein, so he promptly turned back till he arrived at the crossroads, when he proceeded along the road leading east. For some time he saw nothing new or strange. The road wound among many small fields and brushwood, with here and there some groups of tall, dark pine trees. But after passing through a narrow defile, he suddenly came to a large, deep valley, in the center of which rose a fine, big house, standing quite by itself on a steep, rocky mound. At first he could see no way of getting up to it, but presently he noticed a narrow path, almost hidden by trees and thicket, so, fastening his horses to a stake, he made his way up to the house. As he approached, he saw the door was wide open and no one anywhere about. Thorstein therefore went in and came into a big hall, in which stood 2 huge beds, one on each side, covered with rich silken hangings, while down the middle ran a table, ready laid with 2 plates, 2 knives and forks, 2 great goblets of rarely chased silver, and 2 large golden flagons of wine. But no one was visible here either. After waiting a short time to see if the owners would appear, Thorstein went down the hill again to look after his horses, for he thought he might as well stay the night in the house, even if there were a little danger in so doing. So he lifted the saddles off the horses, tethered them with sufficient length of rope that they could both graze and lie down comfortably, and then took all he needed out of his saddlebags, with his sword, which, after his favorite chestnut, was his most precious possession. Then, giving a last look to the horses to see they were all right, He returned to the house, and going to the kitchen, he brought thence some bread and the meat which was roasting before the fire. Cutting this up carefully, he placed a good portion in each plate, together with a large slice of bread. He then went to the beds, shook up the pillows, and made them all ready for the night. After this, feeling rather tired, he thought he would lie down and rest. He did not, however, venture to occupy either of the beds, but threw himself down on some mats that lay in a corner, carefully pulling one over him. After lying awake for some time, Thorstein was just dropping off to sleep when he heard loud underground rumblings. Presently the door was thrown open, and he heard heavy steps crossing the floor. Then a loud, gruff voice exclaimed, "Someone has been here, but whoever it is, we shall soon put an end to him." "No," answered another voice, "that you shall not do. I take him, whoever it may be, under my protection. I have the right to do this, for it is my turn, and can dispose of him as I like. He came here of his own free will, and has shown himself both able and willing to be useful. He has made our beds, prepared our food, and all has been well done. Let him now show himself, and no harm shall befall him." When Thorstein heard these words, he once again began to breathe freely, and throwing back the rug he had drawn over him, stood up before them. The young men were regular giants, both in size and strength, especially the elder, who had taken his part, and who was quite a head taller than his brother. Thorstein then went to fetch another plate and cup, and shared in the giant's meal, after which the two brothers retired to their beds, Thorstein again taking possession of his rugs, where he soon fell soundly asleep, never waking till long after the sun had risen. Then, while they were at breakfast, the elder giant, whose name was Osric, asked Thorstein whether he would stay on with them, that all he would have to do would be to get their meals ready for them and make their beds. He might also keep his horses in their stables, and as to food and wine, Thorstein would only have to tell them what was needed, and they would always keep the larder and cellar filled, so that Thorstein need never leave the hill. Thorstein said he would try it for a week. At the end of that time, the giants were so well pleased with him that they urged him to remain with them, for a year at any rate, and though Thorstein found the life rather dull and stupid, he agreed to stop, Osric, the elder giant, promising him a rich reward at the end of his term. He then handed him the keys of all the rooms in the house except one key, and this the giant always wore fastened to a string round his neck, only taking it off at night when he went to bed. When the two brothers had gone off on their daily expeditions, Thorstein made a regular round of the house, looking into the storerooms, cellars, and every room except the one of which Osric kept the key. In vain he tried all the keys on his bunch, hoping one of them might open the lock, but in vain. He then tried to force open the door by throwing himself against it with all his might, but in this also he failed. Later on, Thorstein noticed that Osric always went into this room every night and morning, while Bifru, the younger giant, waited for him outside. So one day he asked Osric why, when handing him the keys of all the other rooms, he had kept back this one. "Surely," he continued, "if you have found me faithful in all you have entrusted me with, you might also trust me with what is in that room." But Osric said there was really nothing particular in the room. Thorstein might be quite sure of that, for, having found him so faithful and honest respecting everything placed under his care, they would certainly also have trusted him if there had been anything valuable in that room. But although Thorstein pretended that he was quite satisfied with the giant's answer, he made up his mind to solve the mystery in some way. At length the end of the year arrived, and the two giant brothers, well pleased to have secured so careful a servant, gave him as his wages 2 great sacks filled with gold. They had never been made so comfortable before, and again begged Thorstein to remain another year. To this Thorstein would not agree, but said he would remain 6 months, as he was more than ever determined to find out the mystery of the locked room. He therefore carefully watched every opportunity, hoping Osric might perhaps by chance leave the key behind him. But the giant was much too careful to do so. One morning, when Thorstein had risen particularly early in order to bake the bread, the thought of the locked chamber came constantly before him, and while kneading the dough he kept puzzling his head as to how he could circumvent the giant. Suddenly, a bright idea struck him. Creeping softly to the back door which led into the stable-yard, he gave a loud knock and then ran back as quickly as he could to the room where the giants were sleeping, and asked them with a scared face, holding the dough he had been kneading in his hands, whether they had not heard someone knocking. "Oh, yes," they both replied. "We did hear something, but we thought it was you knocking down a chair while you were sweeping." Thorstein declared he had not knocked down anything, and added that he was afraid to open the door, for he was quite positive someone had knocked there. The giants said he was quite right not to open it, for it might be some unfriendly giant, so they got up themselves and ran to the door to see who had disturbed them at that early hour in the morning. No sooner had they left the room than Thorstein drew forth the key of the mysterious chamber, which the biggest giant always kept under his pillow at night, and quickly taking an impression of it in the dough he had in his hand, replaced the key in its former place. When the brothers came back they were not a little put out, for of course they found no one at the door, and declared that Thorstein had only said it in order to make fun of them. But this Thorstein denied stoutly, and maintained that he had heard someone knocking, and supposed whoever it was must have run away. Hans then blew up the fire and began searching round the cave. In addition to the king's 3 treasures, he found several great chests filled with gold and precious stones. Then he noticed that there was a smaller cave at the back, and, lighting a pine knot, he entered and found his brothers. He immediately loosened their bands, and they were both so grateful to be freed from the terrible fate in store for them that they ever after treated him as true brothers should. They all 3 then set to work and carried the treasures from the cave to the ship, and when everything had been taken on board, they quickly returned to the king's country, where they arrived on Christmas Eve, greatly to the astonishment of the whole court, who had quite given them up as lost. But greater still was the surprise of everyone when Hans presented the king with the 3 treasures which had been so long lost and were now once again restored to the kingdom. The king was so delighted at having at last gained his wish and recovered the long-lost treasures that he told Hans he should always look upon him as a dear son, and that he should certainly marry his daughter. So Hans was dressed in royal robes, and very shortly after married the fair Princess Gerda, who had long secretly admired him. The wedding was held with all possible magnificence. No expense was spared, and gifts were given to all the poor in the land. The king then divided his kingdom in half, putting Hans in charge of one, whereupon he sent for his father and mother, and gave them a good house and sufficient money to live in comfort for the rest of their days. And the 2 elder brothers were also provided for. Hans and Gerda reigned long and happily. Puss always had a place of honor beside his beloved master, and lived long enough to see Hans's children and even grandchildren. The Giants and the Granite Boat. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who were greatly beloved by all their people. They had only one son named Sigurd, who, even as a boy, was distinguished for his marvelous skill and dexterity in all manly sports and pastimes, whilst his strength was only equalled by his wisdom and his handsome person. Years passed on. Sigurd had become a man, when one day the king called him to him. "My son," he said, "it is now time for you to choose a fitting bride. I am getting old, and cannot expect to live much longer. You must take my place in a few years, and must try to gain men's respect and esteem by showing yourself capable of winning a princess worthy to share your throne. Visit first the country of Hardrada, my friend. His daughter is indeed, I hear, a marvel of beauty and goodness." Sigurd at once prepared to start on his journey. With a few chosen companions, he set sail in his noble galley, the high prow breasting the waves, and the stern all gorgeous with carving and gilding glittering in the sun. After sailing for some days over the tossing waters, the vessel at length reached Hardrada's country. It was night, one of those glorious summer nights of the north, when the moon is almost as brilliant as the sun. The bold shore, with its strange, grotesque crags and peaks, seemed utterly unapproachable, till suddenly a large creek or fjord was seen, at the head of which rose the king's palace. The windows were all ablaze with light, and the sounds of music and revelry told the travelers that some banquet was in progress. Leaving their ship, Sigurd and his companions proceeded towards the palace, where they received the warmest of welcomes from the king and his daughter Helga. The princess was indeed all she had been pictured, tall and beautiful, and so gentle and charming that Sigurd made up his mind to win her. Next morning he acquainted the king with the object of his journey, and gained his consent. Hardrada was indeed anxious to have a son-in-law to share the cares of his kingdom, which, now that he was an old man, weighed heavily upon him. As a condition of his remaining with Hardrada, Sigurd only stipulated that he should return to his own country directly his father sent for him. So the marriage of Sigurd the Brave with Helga the Fair took place with great pomp and rejoicing, thanes and nobles coming from all parts to bring presents to the young people. Sigurd and his wife loved each other very dearly, and their happiness was completed when, after the lapse of a year, a son was born to them, inheriting the beauty of the mother and the strength and handsome form of the father. 3 happy years thus passed away, little Kurt being 2 years old, when Sigurd received the news of his father's death and a recall to his native land. It was a sad parting between Helga and her father, but Sigurd dared not linger, and once more the beautiful Viking ship started on its voyage through the sun-tipped waves, bearing the young king and his wife and child. For several days the wind was favorable, but when within a day's sail of Sigurd's country, the vessel ran into an extraordinary calm. Day after day the sun blazed down fierce and strong. Not a breath of air was to be felt. In the forepart of the vessel the men had all gone below. Sigurd's companions were also asleep, while he and his wife remained on deck beneath the awning, talking quietly, with little Kurt playing at their feet. After a little, a strange drowsiness seemed to overpower Sigurd himself, and, declaring he could no longer keep awake, he too went below and fell asleep like the others. Helga was now quite alone on deck with her boy. Suddenly, as she was playing with him, she saw a strange object moving slowly along the smooth surface of the water. Shading her eyes with her hands, she watched it, and as it came nearer she made out that it was a boat with a curious, ungainly form seated in it rowing. Nearer and nearer it came, with silent, swift strokes, and as it touched the vessel with a hard sound, the queen saw that it was very large and cut out of granite. With one spring the terrible giantess who had been rowing it was on deck. Like one in a dream, the queen could neither move nor utter a sound to arouse the king or the ship's crew. She seemed held by an invisible power. The giantess came up to her and, snatching away the child, placed him behind her. Then she proceeded to take off all the young queen's beautiful embroidered robes, leaving her only a single linen garment, and as she herself put on Helga's clothes, she gradually also assumed her shape and likeness. Lastly, she seized the queen and placed her in the granite boat, saying as she did so in a terrible voice, "Obey my words and my magic spell. Thou must neither rest nor pause on the way, till thou reachest my brother in the lower regions." The poor queen, half fainting and utterly powerless, sat still and silent in the boat like a statue. With a strong push, the giantess sent the boat from the vessel's side, and it was speedily lost to sight. Then little Kurt began to cry. In vain the giantess tried to soothe him. The more she attempted it, the worse he became, till at length, losing all patience, she snatched him up and carried him down to the king. Waking him roughly, she upbraided him loudly for leaving her alone on deck with the child. "It was most careless and negligent of you," she went on. "Someone ought to have been left on guard while you were asleep. No one can tell what may happen when one is thus left alone." As it is, I found it impossible to quiet the child. I have therefore brought him down here, which is the proper place for him. It is high time you roused your lazy crew. A favorable wind has at last sprung up, and we can have a chance of getting off this wretched ship." Sigurd was astonished at being addressed by his queen in such terms. In all their married life he had never heard her speak like that. He, however, decided to take no notice of it. She must be overtired with the heat, he thought, and, answering her very gently, he endeavored to quiet the child. The little fellow, however, sobbed and cried as much as ever. By this time the crew were aroused, the sails hoisted, and, the wind freshening splendidly, they reached land the following day. Here the whole country was still in mourning for the late king. But the people rejoiced greatly when it became known that Sigurd had returned in safety. He was crowned amid universal acclamations, and at once took the reins of government into his hands. But ever since the strange calm at sea, the king's little son had never ceased crying and sobbing, especially in the presence of his supposed mother, while before that time he had been a remarkably happy, affectionate child. The king, therefore, chose a nurse for him from among the people at his court, and when he was with her, the little fellow seemed to be once more the bright, happy child he had been. The king could not, however, understand the change that had come over the queen ever since their journey. She, who formerly had always been so good and gentle, was now obstinate, cross, and untruthful, and ere long others began to notice the disagreeable, quarrelsome nature of the king's wife. Now, there were at the court 2 young men who were so devoted to playing chess that they would sit for hours over their game, instead of joining in the outdoor sports of the other young courtiers. As they were the king's cousins, their room was in the palace, and it happened to be next to that of the queen. She had been particularly rude and disagreeable to them ever since she came, and they would have been glad to revenge themselves upon her in any way. One day, hearing her moving about and talking angrily, they looked through a slit in the door, and distinctly heard her say, "When I yawn slightly, I grow small and dainty like a young maiden. When I give a bigger yawn, I grow into half a giantess. But when I stretch out my arms and yawn with all my might, I return to my original size and become a mighty giantess." And as she said these words, she stretched herself, yawned frightfully, as if her jaws would break, and suddenly grew into a monstrous and terrible giantess. Then, stamping her foot, the floor opened, and up came a 3-headed giant, bearing a huge trough of raw meat. Greeting the queen as his sister, he placed the trough before her, and she devoured the contents, never resting till she had emptied it. The 2 young courtiers watched this strange scene, though they could not hear all that the giantess and her brother said to one another. They were horrified to see how greedily she devoured the raw meat, and amazed at the quantity she ate, for at the king's table she only picked daintily at the dishes. As soon as she had emptied the trough, the 3-headed giant disappeared in the same manner as he had come, and the queen, giving a slight yawn, at once assumed her human figure again. The young princes then returned to their game, discussing the mystery in undertones. And what of the king's little son all this time? One evening, when the nurse had lighted her lamp and was playing with the child in her arms, some of the boards in the center of the floor opened, and a most lovely lady, wearing only a single white linen garment, stepped forth. Her waist was encircled by a heavy iron ring, to which was attached a chain which descended right down through the hole in the floor. With a soft little cry, she ran up to the nurse, took the little boy in her arms, kissed him and fondled him, and, after lavishing no end of caresses on him, gently placed him back in his nurse's arms, and disappeared in the same way as she had come, the floor closing over her again. All this time she never spoke a single word. The nurse was greatly amazed at the incident, but, startled though she was, she did not say a word to anyone. The next evening the same thing occurred. The white-robed lady came up through the floor, took the child, kissed and caressed him lovingly, and then replaced him in his nurse's arms. But this time, when she prepared to descend, she murmured in sorrowful tones, "Twice this happiness has been permitted. Once more, and then all will be over." Then she disappeared, and the floor closed over her as before. The nurse became greatly alarmed when she heard the White Lady say those words. She feared that some danger must threaten the child, and yet she had been much taken with the stranger, who had caressed the boy as if he were her own. She therefore thought it best to speak to the king, tell him what had happened, and beg him to be present at the time when the white-robed lady was wont to appear. The king listened attentively to the woman's story, and, suspecting foul play, promised he would be there. The following evening, therefore, found him betimes in the nursery, seated in a chair, with his sword drawn close to the spot where the stranger had always appeared. He had not long to wait. With a faint grating noise the boards opened, and forth stepped the beautiful white-robed figure, with the iron ring round her waist and the long trailing chain. In an instant Sigurd recognized in her his own beloved wife Helga, and quick as lightning he seized her in his arms, and with one stroke of his sword cut the chain that fastened her. Immediately the most terrible groans and rumblings issued from the earth. The whole castle rocked and trembled, and everyone thought that an earthquake was taking place. But in a short time the unearthly sounds ceased without any damage having been done. Then Helga related to her dear lord all that had befallen her, how the wicked giantess had come to the ship in her granite boat when they were all asleep, and with her magic power had taken away all her clothes and put them on herself. When she had placed me in the granite boat, it floated on by itself until the ship was quite out of sight, she continued, and then I perceived we were going towards a large dark object which, as we came near to land, I saw was a huge three-headed giant. He wanted me to marry him, but I steadfastly refused to be his wife, whereupon he chained me up in a big lonely cave, telling me I should never be free unless I consented. Every second day he came, repeating the same request and the same threats. Then, as time went on and I saw no hope of help, I began to think how I could escape his hands. At last I told him that I would be his wife if he would allow me to visit my son on the earth for 3 days running. At first he would not consent, but when I persisted he gave in, but I had to promise that I would not say who I was. He then placed this iron ring round my waist, to which he attached a chain, the other end being fastened to himself. I hoped that perhaps one evening you might be there when I came to see our little kirk. How sadly my heart failed me when the second evening passed without my seeing you, but my prayers never ceased, and now my reward has come. The terrible groans when you cut the chain must have been the giant. He would fall when the strain was suddenly taken off the chain, for he lives right under the castle. He probably broke his neck when he fell, and the terrible shock must have been his death throes. Now the king saw clearly why he could not reconcile the behavior of the giantess with that of the gentle Helga, his own dear queen. The hideous impostor, who had now reverted to her original form, was summoned before the state council, and, as additional evidence against her, the 2 young princes related what they had heard and seen. She was condemned to be stoned to death, and her body was put into a sack and torn to pieces by wild horses. No sooner had he done so than a strong wind arose, and in one moment all the feathers were whirled away, not a single one remaining. In despair, Harold called out, "Dear Tritill, dear Little, and all my dear birds, oh, come and help me if you can." And almost before the words had passed his lips, Tritill, Little, and the whole flight of birds came bringing the feathers with them, and while Tritill and Little helped Harold to fill the bed and the pillows and sew them up again, the birds flew round, picking up all the stray feathers so that none were missing. But out of each pillow they took 1 feather, and, tying them together, told Harold that when the giantess missed them and threatened to kill him, he was to tickle her nose with the feathers. Thereupon Tritill, Litill, and the birds all disappeared. When the giantess came home in the evening, she went up to her bed and threw herself down on it so heavily that the whole cave shook. Then she began carefully feeling all over the bed, and when she came to the pillows, she cried out, "Aha, man! I have caught you. There is a feather missing in each pillow. Now I shall hang you like your brothers." But as she took hold of him, Harold quickly pulled the 2 feathers out of his pocket and tickled her nose with them. In an instant the giantess fell back on her bed, looking terribly white and frightened. But Harold laughingly gave her back her feathers, telling her he did not want to keep them. "Ah, man," said the giantess, "I know you did not do this alone, but I will let it pass this time." So this 3rd night Harold also passed in the cave, and in the morning the giantess said to him, "I have some fresh work for you today. You must kill one of my oxen. Then you must scrape and clean the skin to make a leather bag, cut up the animal in joints ready for cooking, clean all the entrails, and make spoons out of its horns. All must be finished ere I return this evening. I have 50 oxen, as you see, and it is one of these I want killed. I shall not, however, tell you which one I have fixed upon, that you must find out for yourself. If all is done as I wish when I return, you can depart in the morning and go wherever you like, and in addition, as a reward, you may choose 3 things from among such of my treasures as I value most. If, however, everything is not finished, or if you kill the wrong animal, then it will cost you your life, and I shall hang you the same as I did your brothers." And so saying, the giantess departed. Harold was sorely puzzled. How could he possibly decide which of the animals the giantess wished killed? Then he remembered his friends. "Dear Tritill, dear Litill, come once again to my aid," he cried. Hardly had the words passed his lips than he saw them both coming towards him, leading a huge ox between them. They at once set to work and killed him, and while Harold cleaned the entrails and cut up the joints, Tritill scraped the skin and prepared it for making the bag, and Litill began fashioning the spoons out of the horns. So the work sped along quickly and merrily, and all was ready ere the sun sank to rest. Harold now told his friends what the giantess had promised him if he should have finished his task ere she returned. "Can you advise me what to ask for?" he said. Then they told him he should first ask for that which was over her bed, then for the chest which stood beside her bed, and lastly for that which was behind the wall of her bed. Harold thanked them warmly for all they had done for him, and said he would do as they had told him, whereupon the little men disappeared. When the giantess came home in the evening and found that Harold had finished all the tasks she had set him, she exclaimed, "Ah, man! You never did all this alone, but you have conquered, so I must let it pass." And so saying, she retired to rest. The next morning the giantess called Harold into the inner cave and told him he might choose the reward she had promised him, and that then he might go where he liked. "Then," said Harold, "if I may have whatever I like, I choose first that which is above your bed, then the chest which is beside your bed, and lastly that which is behind the wall of your bed." "Ah, man!" cried the giantess. "You have not chosen these things by yourself, but I cannot refuse you. You are too strong for me, and you have conquered, and I must give you the reward you claim." So saying, she mounted some steps above her bed cut into the rock, and, opening a secret door, she led forth a beautiful maiden. This was none other than the fair Princess Enid, who had disappeared so mysteriously some time ago. "Take her back to her father, and he will reward you as you deserve," said the giantess as she placed the princess's hand in that of Harold. She then opened the lid of the chest beside her bed. This was filled with gold, pearls, and precious stones, and then moving aside the bed, she touched a secret spring, and the wall sliding back, they saw the blue sea, and anchored close to the cave lay a beautiful ship, possessing the power of sailing wherever its owner wished, without aid of either captain or crew. When the giantess had handed him over these gifts, she told Harold that he would henceforth be one of the happiest and luckiest of men. Harold then carried the chest containing the gold and precious stones on board ship, and then, having arranged some soft cushions for the Princess Enid in the stern of the vessel, they quickly departed and reached her father's country. The delight of the king and queen on recovering their long-lost daughter can be more easily imagined than described. They never tired hearing of the wonderful adventures through which Harold had gone, and the king ordered a great feast in honor of the rescuer of his child, which ended with the wedding of Enid and Harold. The king then made Harold his prime minister, and so well and so wisely did he rule the country that on the king's death he was chosen to succeed him, and he and Queen Enid lived long and happily together, seeing their children and grandchildren growing up around them. Logging Injibji. Chapter 3. The Mystery of the Locked Room. As soon as the giants had gone forth that day to seek for treasure, as usual, Thorstein tried to make a key at the giant's forge from the impression he had taken in the dough, but many and fruitless were the trials ere he succeeded. Then, watching his opportunity, when the brothers had gone on a long expedition, he unlocked the forbidden door and entered the mysterious chamber. At first he could see nothing, for it was almost dark, the single window being heavily barred and shuttered. But having struck a light, he glanced eagerly round. There, to his amazement and horror, he saw a young girl fastened to a nail in the wall by her long plaits of hair. Mounting on a chair, he hastened to release her, and begged her to tell him who she was, and how and why she had come there. At first the poor girl could scarcely believe that she had at last found a friend, but Thorstein looked so good and kind that her fears quickly vanished. "Alas," she said, "I am a most unhappy maiden. My name is Thekla, and my father is King Alfhelm. One day, as I was playing in a field near the palace with my maidens, a great giant suddenly rushed in among us from the neighboring wood, and snatching me up in his arms, despite all my cries and struggles, carried me down to the shore where his boat was waiting. Ere any help could reach us, we were well out of sight, till at length we arrived at this place. He then asked me to marry him, which I indignantly refused to do, and though he comes every day to try and persuade me to consent, I will never give in, no, not though they starve or kill me." And she burst again into bitter sobs. Thorstein tried to comfort her as best he could. He told her that, having now made a key, he would be able to come and see her every day while the giants were away. He then brought her some food, for the poor girl was half starved, as the giant only gave her just enough to keep her alive. And then, as evening drew near, Thorstein again fastened Thekla's hair to the nail, ere he closed the door before the giant's return. From that day forward, Thorstein visited the poor girl regularly every day, always bringing her some food, and then putting all straight again ere the brothers returned, so that they had no idea of what took place during their absence. When the end of the 6 months drew near, Thorstein told the giants that he wished to leave. But they had got so used to him, and he waited on them so carefully, that they did not want to part with him, and begged him to remain another year. At first Thorstein refused, but after much persuasion, the brothers giving him again 2 more sacks of gold as wages, Thorstein said he would remain another 6 months, if at the end of that time they would give him as wages whatever was in the locked room, no matter whether it was valuable or not. When Osric heard this, he grew very angry, and told Thorstein not to be a fool, that what he was asking for was utterly worthless, and that he had much better accept the good wages they were quite willing to give him. Thorstein, however, would not give in. He said he did not care whether the contents of the room were valuable or not. He had set his heart upon that, and nothing else, and would remain with them on no other condition. Osric grew furious, and they argued and fought over this, till at last Bifru, seeing that Thorstein was quite determined, advised his brother to give in, for they could keep him in no other way. So the big giant at last agreed to his terms. During the 6 months that followed, Thorstein did his utmost to lighten Thekla's imprisonment. Many a long and pleasant chat they had together, planning their future life, while Thekla described her former home, and how delighted her father would be to see her safely back again. At length the weary 6 months came to an end, and though the giant brothers again tried to persuade Thorstein to remain with them, he was firm and would listen to no further promises of future wealth and greatness with which they tried to bribe him. So, seeing that neither persuasions nor threats would prevail, Osric at last opened the door and brought out Thekla. Very much surprised he was to see her looking so well when he saw her in the daylight, and half repented him of his promise. But Thorstein led forth his 2 horses, which he had all this time carefully groomed and tended. Placing 2 sacks of gold on each, he lifted Thekla on one horse, and buckling on his sword as well as a sharp dagger, mounted the other horse. As he did so, Thekla noticed the giants whispering together, and heard the younger one mutter with a laugh, "Yes, as soon as they get to the ravine." "Oh, Thorstein," she said when they had ridden on a short distance, "I know they mean to attack us." "I heard them say so." "Never fear," replied Thorstein. "My good sword has never failed me yet. But you ride on in front." As soon as they were out of sight, he placed the other sacks of gold on Thekla's horse, and bidding her ride on ahead, he drew his sword and kept a keen lookout. They rode on thus for some little distance. The country was open, and though the road was rough, they were soon out of sight of the castle. At length they arrived at the narrow ravine which led down to the shore. They had not long entered it when they heard the clatter of horses' hoofs behind them. Thorstein bade Thekla ride on. He then hid himself behind a projecting rock, and as Bifru, who was in front, rode past, Thorstein rushed at him, and with one blow of his sword severed his head from his body. Osric, seeing what had befallen his brother and fearing the same fate, rode back to the castle for more help. Thorstein then joined Thekla, who had anxiously watched the combat, and they rode on, hoping that all danger of pursuit was now over. But just as they emerged from the ravine, Thorstein, looking back, saw Osric, accompanied by a still bigger and fiercer-looking giant, hurrying after them. Again sending Thekla on in front, he turned and faced his enemies. A terrible combat now ensued. They attacked Thorstein, one on each side, but he swung his great broadsword round his head and with one blow cut off Osric's head. Then the big giant, seeing his friend fall to the ground, grew furious. He threw away his sword, and grasping Thorstein round the waist, flung him to the ground. But in an instant Thorstein was on his feet again, and now a desperate conflict ensued. They wrestled together fiercely. Sometimes one, sometimes the other was uppermost, but at length the giant's weight and size began to tell, and Thekla was horrified to see Thorstein grow pale and stagger. Without a moment's thought or hesitation, she sprang from her horse and, snatching up the dagger that had fallen from Thorstein's girdle during the struggle, she thrust it through the heart of the giant, who rolled over on his side without a groan. Both the giant brothers and their friend being now dead, Thorstein said they had better return to their house and take possession of all the treasure they could find. This they did, and by making several journeys backwards and forwards, they had quite a large store of boxes on the shore, filled with gold and precious stones. Then, to their joy, they one day saw a vessel nearing the land, which, as it came closer, proved to be a ship belonging to Thekla's father, the captain, called Randur, being one of his chief ministers. The latter was delighted when he saw Thekla, for her father had been so greatly distressed at her disappearance that he had fitted out several ships to go in search of her, promising that he would bestow her as a bride on whoever was fortunate enough to find her. Randur therefore at once offered to take them home, and sent some of his men ashore to help and carry Thorstein's treasure down to the ship. When everything was put on board, the sails were set, and the good vessel sped gallantly on her homeward way. A great feast was immediately prepared to celebrate the happy restoration of the lost queen and her 3 children. This feast lasted many days, for all who chose to come were welcome. Indeed, it seemed as if the king could not do enough to show how thankful he was. He remitted the sentences of many state prisoners, and all the poor in the kingdom received rich gifts. When at length the feast came to an end, Prince Odo asked the king for the hand of his daughter, the fair Princess Olga. Thereupon a fresh feast was arranged to celebrate the marriage of the prince and princess, and this was carried out with still greater splendor, such as had never been seen before. Not only was the big hall of the palace prepared for the invited guests, but endless tables were spread in the great courtyard for all the poor and homeless, to whom abundant good fare was generously dispensed. For, Princess Olga said, as they had been poor themselves, they must never forget their less fortunate subjects. Then, when it was over, Prince Odo returned to his own kingdom with his wife, where they reigned in peace and happiness for many years. Wilhelm married a beautiful cousin, and succeeded to the throne at his father's death. Sigurd also married a lovely princess in a neighboring state, and came to the throne on the death of his father-in-law. Thus Olga and her brothers, after all their trials, lived long and happily, their children and children's children reigning after them for many generations. The Fair and the Dark Isolde. Chapter 4. Haltherstein's kind actions received their reward. Thekla and Thorstein now thought all their trials were surely over, and gave themselves up to the enjoyment of each other's society. But Randr had no intention of letting the latter reach Thekla's home, so he watched his opportunity, and one night when they were well out at sea he had one of the boats lowered. In this he placed Thorstein, who was fast asleep in the after part of the ship, and, casting loose the boat, let it drift away. He then made the men take a solemn oath never to mention what had been done, but that if anyone asked about Thorstein, they were to say they knew nothing about him. Next morning, when Thekla, surprised at not seeing Thorstein, asked where he was, Randur pretended to be greatly surprised at his non-appearance, and instituted a search all over the vessel for him. Thekla was very unhappy to think that Thorstein should have disappeared so unaccountably. Then, suddenly missing one of the boats, she said that perhaps he had gone fishing, and insisted upon the vessel being put about to search for him. But though Randur pretended to obey her orders, shifting the sails and issuing various commands, he was in reality hurrying home as fast as he could, rejoicing at having so successfully rid himself of his rival. The boat, meanwhile, in which Thorstein lay fast asleep, had drifted a long distance from the ship ere he awoke, and on first opening his eyes he could not imagine where he was. But when he once realized his position, he decided that Randur's jealousy must have played him this trick, and he set himself to think what he had better do. When Randur had sent him adrift, he had put neither food nor water in the boat, and as the sun rose higher and higher in the heavens, the heat grew intense. In vain he steeped his clothes in the water, hoping thus at least to assuage his thirst, which was causing him much suffering. He gradually grew more faint and weary, and a feeling of hopelessness was stealing over him, when suddenly he heard a voice saying, "Do not lose heart, Thorstein, though your plight is sad, drifting thus hopelessly about on the ocean. But as you once spent your all to give me rest, so now I will also aid you." And immediately the boat flew rapidly over the water, propelled by an unseen force. Thorstein's thirst and weariness vanished, and he reached the island where Thekla's father lived at the same time as the ship in which she was returning, though he landed at a different point. As Thorstein stepped on shore, he again heard the strange voice saying, I am only repaying what I owe you, for had you not given up all you possessed to the farmer to whom I was in debt, he would never have allowed my bones to rest in peace in the grave. And now I will help you further. This is King Alfhelm's country. Go to the palace, and there offer to look after the king's chestnut horses, of which he is very proud. His late groom was very careless, and has been dismissed, so he will engage you. But remember, whatever is found beneath the horses' mangers belongs to you, and you can keep it." So saying, the spirit of the dead man departed, and Thorstein, having thanked him gratefully, at once started off for the king's palace. King Alfhelm, who had been rather at a loss as to whom to entrust with his fine chestnut horses, of which he was very proud, was greatly pleased with Thorstein's appearance, and at once put him in charge of the stable, where Thorstein, to his surprise, saw his own chestnut among the other horses, for Randor, on landing, had given it as a present to the king. But the horse would allow no strange hand to come near it. The moment it saw Thorstein, however, it became gentle as a lamb. The king, meanwhile, was greatly rejoiced at his daughter's safe return, for he had almost given up all hope of ever seeing her again. So he ordered a great feast to be prepared to celebrate her arrival, and believing Rondor's tale that he had rescued the princess from the giants, promised to give him his daughter in marriage. To this, however, Thekla objected. "Rather than wed Randor, I will remain single all my life," she said. This threat so frightened the king, for, having no son, he looked forward to seeing Thekla's children growing up, that he did not urge her any further. Thekla then begged her father to summon the new groom to the great hall that evening, for she had been told that he had traveled a great deal, and it would amuse them all to hear his adventures. So the king, willing to please his daughter and anxious himself to hear the tale of his adventures, summoned Thorstein to the big hall where the whole court was assembled. And then the whole truth came to light, and when King Alfhelm heard the wickedness and treachery of his minister, he grew so angry that he ordered Randor to be torn to pieces by wild horses. Their father, therefore, had a beautiful palace built for them, where they had as many servants as they wanted, and everything they could possibly wish for. Here the brother and sister lived together very happily until the queen fell ill, and feeling her end was drawing near, she called the king to her bedside. "Dear husband," she said, "we have lived very happily together, but now my end is drawing near, and before I die, I hope you will grant 2 requests I wish to make. First, if ever you marry again, do not choose your wife from any small village or lonely island, but bring your bride from one of the large cities in the neighboring kingdoms. If you do this, good fortune will attend you. Secondly, never let any one or anything come between you and our dear children. They will bring you good luck and happiness if you always let them stand first in your love and affection." When the queen had spoken these words, she lay back and died. The king was very grieved at her death. He sorrowed so greatly that he never left his room and would not see anyone, and all the affairs of the kingdom came to a standstill. Then one day the prime minister came to him and told him that there would be a rebellion and that the country would go to ruin if he continued to shut himself up instead of attending to the affairs of his kingdom. "It is far more kingly," he concluded, "to pull yourself together and try and overcome your grief for the sake of your people than to sit alone and lament. Besides, why should you not look around for another queen who will be worthy to succeed your late consort?" "Alas, that will be no easy task," said the king, sighing deeply. "I will not, however, gainsay your words. As, however, such is your advice, it is best that the responsibility of the choice should also be yours. I therefore empower you to find me a bride worthy to share my throne and be a successor to my late wife. I only make one stipulation. You must not seek her in any small village or lonely island, but from some large neighboring state." The minister, Delighted that he had at last roused the king and filled with the importance of his mission, promised to bear in mind the king's instructions and set about preparing for the journey. The king provided him with a magnificent outfit and a large and imposing following, and started him on his journey. When they had sailed for about 3 days on their way to the neighboring kingdom, suddenly a thick white fog arose. They could no longer see where they were going, and for a whole month they sailed about first in one direction, then in another, for they had lost all reckoning. Whichever way they steered their vessels, no land was in sight, and they were beginning to lose all heart when at length one day they saw a faint gray line on the horizon. Gradually, as they came nearer, they could distinguish hills and trees, and finding a nice, gently shelving beach in a sheltered nook, they ran their boats ashore, and landing, pitched their tents on the strand. But not a single human being was in sight. All was perfectly still, and they thought they must have landed on a desert island. While the men, tired with their exertions, were resting, the minister decided to go on a little way inland and explore, and as the sun was now very hot, for it was about midday, he bent his steps towards a forest he saw some little way ahead. He had not gone very long in that direction when he suddenly heard a harp being played. Following the sound, he came to an open glade, and there, sitting on a fallen tree, he saw a beautiful woman, so grand, so stately, he thought he had never before seen anyone so enchanting. Her playing on the harp was so perfect that it was happiness only to listen to her, while at her feet sat the loveliest maiden he had ever seen, whose sweet voice accompanied the harpist. The Prime Minister doffed his hat and bowed courteously to the lady, who, on seeing him approach, rose and returned his greeting with much friendliness, asking him where he was going and what was the object of his journey. The minister, quite charmed with her kindness, told her the purpose of his coming. "How strange," said the lady, "for almost the same thing has happened to me. I, too, have lost my husband. He was one of the great kings who reigned on this continent, but, alas, one sad day the Vikings came. They overran the whole land, killed my husband, and took possession of this country. It was only with great difficulty, and not without much danger, that I managed to escape with this maiden, who is my daughter." When the girl heard this, she said softly, "Is that the truth you are speaking?" A sharp slap on the ear, while the minister was looking at the harp, rewarded the girl's speech. "Don't forget what I told you," muttered the lady. The Prime Minister, who had not noticed anything, now asked the lady what her name was, and whether he could do anything for her. "I am called Blover," she replied, "and my daughter's name is Lofi. Then the minister sat down beside her and began to talk to her, finding her very clever and well-informed, and fearing that if he went further he might fare worse. He thought he could not do better than secure so wise and beautiful a wife for the king, so he made proposals for her hand in his master's name. His embassy seemed very welcome to Blover, who said she would be quite willing to accompany him, and that there need be no delay, for I have all my treasures here with me, and shall not require any attendance beyond my daughter Laufey. And so, without loss of time, the minister conducted Blover and Laufey to the shore. The tents were struck, and the whole party having got on board again, the sails were set, and the ships turned homeward. The dense fog which had accompanied them was now quite dispersed, and they saw that they had landed on a small rocky island, but all were too delighted at the thoughts of the homeward journey to take any notice of this. A fine fresh wind drove the vessels merrily along, and after 6 days' delightful sailing, they came in sight of land, and soon recognized the great high towers of the king's castle. Then the anchors were dropped, and they speedily began to disembark, the minister at once sending a message to King Ring to announce their arrival. The king was delighted to hear that his minister had been so successful. He at once put on his grandest robes of state and, accompanied by his chief ministers and all the principal courtiers, equally richly attired, he proceeded down to the shore to receive and welcome his bride. He had only gone halfway when he met his prime minister, leading 2 beautiful women by the hand. Both were richly dressed in gold-embroidered robes and decked with rare jewels. When King Ring saw all this richness and beauty, he was delighted beyond measure. And when he was told that the elder and the most beautiful of the two was his destined bride, he thought himself the most fortunate of kings. He thanked the minister warmly for what he had done, and in his joyful greeting of mother and daughter he quite forgot to ask whence his bride and her daughter had come, but led them with great pomp into the city, and lodged them in the most magnificent rooms in the palace. A grand wedding feast was speedily arranged, and all the great people in the kingdom were invited. Only Siegfried and Linniec were not asked. The king was so engrossed with his beautiful bride, sitting beside her and talking to her, that he had completely forgotten them. The wedding was one of the grandest that had ever been seen, and after this feast all the guests received rich gifts ere they departed, and then at the end of the week the king began again to look after the affairs of his kingdom. Thus some time passed quietly. The queen was always present when the king received his ministers, and though she never said much, whispers soon went abroad that matters were not as they should be. The queen wished everything to be done her way, and insisted on hearing all that was being arranged, so that King Ring began to think that his marriage was not, after all, such a great piece of luck as he had at first imagined. As for Siegfried and Linniec, the queen never asked about them, nor did she see them. They never came to the palace, but kept to their own house and grounds. Then, after a time, some of the people about the court began to disappear. No one could find out where they had gone, or what had become of them, and it was always those who had opposed the queen in the council. The king, thinking they had gone away because they would not agree to the queen's wishes, at first took no notice of these strange disappearances, but appointed other ministers in their place, and so things went on for some time. Then one day the queen came to the king and said she thought it was time for him to make his journey through the country to collect the revenue. "I have helped you so much in all your business that I can easily carry on the government while you are away, so you need not hurry home, but take your time and enjoy yourself," she added. The king did not much care to go away. He was getting old, and thought his prime minister might well have gone in his stead, but he was falling each day more under the queen's rule. She was the one who settled and decided everything, and if anyone ventured to oppose her, they were made to rue it. The king therefore fitted out his ships for the journey, but he was very sorrowful and sad at heart. When everything was ready for him to start, he went to the house of his 2 children, where of late he had seldom been. A warm greeting welcomed him, and both Siegfried and Linniec could not make enough of their father. When the time for bidding them farewell drew near, the king grew very sad again, and sighing deeply, said, "I cannot tell you, my children, what a sad foreboding haunts me that some evil threatens you. If I should not return from this journey, I fear it will not be safe for you to remain here. Take my advice, therefore, and go away secretly as soon as you are sure that there is no hope of my return. When you start, remember you must go towards the east. You will then soon arrive at a high, steep rock. When you have climbed this rock, you will come to a long, narrow valley. Follow this valley till you come to 2 beautiful trees. The one has bright, glossy green leaves, the other dark bronze ones. They are hollow, and so arranged that they can be securely fastened from the inside, the opening being invisible from the outside. You must each get into one of these trees, and as long as you remain in them, nothing can touch you." Then the king took a tender farewell of his children, and getting on board his ship, the sails were unfurled, and he started off on his journey. They had not, however, been long at sea before a frightful storm arose. Peals of thunder rent the air, the lightning flashed incessantly, and the wind and rain lashed the sea till the waves rose mountains high and engulfed the ships, so that the king and all on board the ships were drowned. That same night of the storm, Prince Siegfried had a strange dream. He saw his father standing beside his bed, his clothes streaming with water. Bending over his son, he took the crown off his head and placed it beside Siegfried on the pillow, and then passed silently away. When Siegfried awoke next morning, he told Linnake his dream, and they both agreed that this could only be a warning from their father, telling them of his death at sea. They therefore quickly gathered together all their clothes and jewels, and ere the sun had fully risen, they were well on their way on the road their father had told them of. When they reached the foot of the hill, they looked back, and there they beheld their stepmother in the distance, following them. She looked so fierce and angry and so big that she appeared more like some terrible giantess than an ordinary woman. Fortunately, they had passed the wood at the foot of the hill, so they set fire to this, and the flames rose so quickly and brightly that their stepmother was unable to pass it, and had to go round. This gave Siegfried and his sister time to get up the hill, but it was a long and weary climb, and once or twice Linnake was fain to sit down, but Siegfried took her up in his arms and carried her till she was again able to walk. At last they reached the narrow valley in which stood the two trees their father had told them of. Linnake chose the one with the bronze-colored leaves, and Siegfried, having seen her safely fastened in, got into the other tree, drawing the opening to after him. But though no one could look into the trees, the rough, thick bark grew in such cunning twists and turns that those inside could see everything that happened outside, and the brother and sister were thus able to talk to one another. About this time there reigned a great and powerful king in Greece called Menelaus. He had two children, a son called Tellus and a daughter called Hebe. They were beautiful, clever, and good, and it would have been difficult to find their equals in all the land. When Tellus grew to man's estate, he distinguished himself by many brave and noble deeds during his numerous warlike expeditions, which often carried him far away into foreign lands. And while thus traveling in search of adventures, he had more than once heard of Princess Linnake, who, it was said, surpassed all other women in beauty, wit, and goodness, so he determined to try and win her for his bride. When he neared the island of King Ring, the wicked queen, who by her enchantments was aware of his coming and also his reasons for so doing, prepared to receive him with all honor. Dressing herself in her most magnificent garments, she ordered Laufey to do the same, and then went down to the shore with her maidens to receive him. The prince, on landing, greeted her with great respect, and asked after King Ring, whereupon the queen, drawing forth her handkerchief, pretended to wipe away her tears, and told him that the king and all his attendants had perished at sea in a frightful gale, and declared she could never get over her great loss. "And where is Princess Linnake?" asked Tellus. "This is my dear stepdaughter," replied the queen, drawing Laufey forward, who, ashamed and angry, had kept in the background. The prince seemed much surprised, for though Laufey was very pretty, yet from the fame of Linnake's beauty he had pictured the latter as much handsomer. But the queen, seeing his disappointment, said he must not be surprised that the dear child looked pale and sad, having lost both father and brother at one blow. Prince Tellus thought this was but natural, so he formally demanded the princess's hand in marriage. As may well be imagined, he did not meet with any opposition from the queen, who said she would hurry on the preparations, but Prince Tellus said he had promised his father that the marriage should take place in Greece, with all due splendor, and that the princess must therefore return with him. The queen offered to accompany them, but this the prince would not consent to. So Laufey and her maidens were escorted to the prince's ship, and they set sail for Greece, leaving Brunhild behind, greatly to her chagrin. They had not sailed far when a dense white mist overtook them. The steersman lost his reckoning, and when at length the fog lifted, they found they had sailed up a beautiful fjord. The mountains with their snowy tops rose steeply on each side at the entrance, but as they got further in, the fjord widened, and grassy slopes shelved down to the golden sands. The prince ordered a boat to be lowered, and getting in, they rowed on till they came to the entrance of a narrow valley in which stood two beautiful trees. The prince landed to look at them. He had never seen anything like them before, and nothing would satisfy him but to have them cut down and carried on board his ship to take back to Greece. No sooner were they brought on board than the fog lifted. The sails were immediately unfurled, and the homeward journey was speedily effected. On his arrival, Prince Tellus at once led Laufey to the palace, where she was received with all honor. He gave her up his own magnificent rooms, which looked on the court where the great fountains played and the beautiful doves circled amid the fruit and flower-laden trees and shrubs. Here Laufey was to spend her days, while at night she retired to the women's apartments under the care of the queen. The two beautiful trees, however, Prince Tellus declared he could not part from, so he had them placed in his room, one at the head and the other at the foot of his couch. Meanwhile, the preparations for the wedding went on apace. The prince, according to the custom of the country, then brought Laufey, believing she was Linnet. 3 pieces of rich silk, to make him 3 tunics. One was blue, the other was red, and the third one was green. She was to make up the blue one first, then the red one, and last of all the green one, which was to surpass both the others in richness and beauty of design. "For," added the prince, "the green one is the one I shall wear on our wedding day." Laufey took the 3 bits of stuff, and the prince departed. But no sooner had he closed the door than, sitting down on the couch between the 2 trees, she burst into tears. Oh, what was she to do? Brunhild had never taught Laufey anything, but just let her grow up as she would, so how could she, who had never had a needle in her hand, make up or embroider these beautiful stuffs? And if the prince discovered how ignorant she was, would he not send her away with scorn and laughter, or perhaps even have her put to death for her deception? And the poor girl sobbed and cried as if her heart would break. Now, as has already been mentioned, Siegfried and Linnet were inside the 2 beautiful trees. They could therefore see all that passed in the prince's chamber, and when they heard poor Laufey's lamentations, Siegfried was so touched at sight of the girl's tears that he said to his sister,
"Sister Linnet, Laufey weeps. Oh, have pity on her, and assist her with her task."
Then Linnet replied, "Hast thou forgotten, O brother, all Brunhild's wicked deeds, and how she endeavored to kill both you and me?" But after a while Linnet consented, and creeping forth from her tree, greatly to Laufey's surprise, she told her who she was and how she came there. Then, sitting down beside her, helped her so effectually with her skilful fingers that the tunic was soon completed, greatly to Laufey's delight. Linnet crept back into her tree, and when Prince Tellus appeared, she showed him the garment. "I have never seen so prettily worked a tunic," he said, greatly pleased. "Now take the piece of red silk and let that be as much more finely embroidered as the stuff itself is richer." But when Laufey found herself confronted with this fresh piece of work, all her courage fled. How could she carry out the prince's wishes? And she began to cry. Then Siegfried again called to his sister. "Sister Linnet, Laufey weeps. Oh, have pity on her, and assist her with her task." And again Linnet answered, "Hast thou forgotten, O brother, Brunhild's wicked deeds, and how she used all endeavors to kill both you and me?" Nevertheless, after a while she again consented to help Laufey, and leaving her tree she sat down beside her, cut out and made up the red tunic, devoting even more care and skill than on the first one. All the seams were embroidered in gold thread, and precious stones bordered the neck and skirt. When it was ready, she gave it to Laufey, while she herself slipped back into her tree. Prince Tellus was greatly pleased when he saw the second tunic. "Why, this is more beautifully worked than the first tunic. I can hardly imagine how you have done it without anyone to help you. Now you must make the third and last tunic. I will give you 3 days to finish it, and remember that this tunic must surpass both the others in beauty of design and richness of embroidery, for I shall wear it on our wedding day." After the prince had gone, Laufey sat down on the couch and felt very sad. How could she hope that Lineik would again help her? She had done so twice, notwithstanding all the ill the queen had intended against her and Siegfried, and it was too much to expect her to aid her again, and, thinking thus sadly, the tears streamed down her cheeks. But Prince Siegfried was so touched by the poor girl's grief that he again said to his sister, "Lineik, sister, Laufey weeps. Oh, have pity on her, and assist her with her task." And again Lineik replied, "Hast thou forgotten, O brother, all Brunhild's wicked deeds, and how she used all her arts to kill both you and me?" Nevertheless, after a while, she again consented to help Laufey, and leaving her tree, she sat down beside her, and with her deft, clever fingers the work made rapid progress, and seemed to grow under her hands. This time she spent even more care and skill on the garment, and when, on the third day, it was finished, there was hardly any portion of the original stuff visible, so thickly was it covered with rich gold and silver scrolls and flowers, starred with rare and precious stones. Lineik and Laufey were so occupied admiring their work, as they sat together on the couch, that they did not hear the lifting of the curtain behind them, as Prince Tellus suddenly entered the room. Lineik, with a cry, started up hastily, and was about to slip back into her tree, but the prince sprang after her, and taking hold of both her hands, led her back to the couch where Laufey sat in fear and trembling. "I have long had my suspicions that some mystery was at work here," he then said, and, seating himself between the two girls, he continued, "Nay, do not fear me, but," turning to Lineik, "tell me your name, and who you are, and how you came here." So Lineik told him who she was, and all about her home, and how she and her brother Siegfried had come in his ship. And as he sat and listened to her, Prince Tellus thought he had never seen anyone so beautiful and clever as Lineik. She was just like what he had always pictured her to himself. Then, casting an angry glance at Laufey, he told her she deserved to be put to death for her deception of him. Then Laufey threw herself on her knees before him and prayed for forgiveness, in which Lineik joined most heartily. "I only deceived you about the work of the tunics," continued Laufey, "for Lineik forbade me to say who had really worked them. You may remember that I never said I was Princess Lineik. It was Queen Brunhild, my mother, as she called herself, who thus deceived you." And while they were thus talking, Prince Siegfried came forth from his tree, whereupon there were fresh explanations, and much rejoicing that the mystery was explained, and Prince Tellus lost no time in claiming the hand of the rightful Princess Lineik. But Lineik said she could not promise to marry anyone till her wicked stepmother, who had wrought such ill to everyone, was driven forth from the kingdom she had usurped. And now Laufey had a wondrous tale to tell. Brunhild was no queen, but a wicked ogress, who reigned over the lonely island where the prime minister had found her. There she had lived in a huge cave, together with other giants and ogres. "I also am a king's daughter," continued Laufey. "But Brunhild, with great skill and cunning, stole me away one day when I was playing in the fields with my little companions. She threatened to kill me if I did not obey her in everything, and called me her daughter, for she thought people would then imagine she also came of a kingly race. It was she who killed your father," continued Laufey, turning to Siegfried, "and all those people at your court who disappeared so mysteriously were eaten by her at night, for all ogres love human flesh. Her object was to get rid of all your chief people, and then bring over her friends, the giants from the stony island, so that they might all live in your rich and fruitful kingdom." When they had heard this tale, Siegfried said he must at once return home and save his country from the giants. Prince Tellus declared he would accompany him, for it was an adventure quite after his own heart. So they got together a large force, and setting sail, a favorable wind speedily brought them to the island, where they landed and surrounded the castle before Brunhild had even heard of their arrival. for very few people were about, the greater portion having been killed by Brunhild, and the rest having fled and hidden themselves to escape from the wicked queen. So there was but little attempt at defense, and Brunhild was taken prisoner. When she saw that her wicked plans had been discovered and that there was no hope of escape, she screamed and raved like a mad woman. But her wicked deeds deserved no pardon. She was condemned to death and her head cut off, after which her body was burnt on a huge funeral pile in the yard of the castle. Then the two princes returned to Greece, and a very gay and splendid double wedding took place, at which all the greatest nobles of the kingdom took part, for on his return, Siegfried, who during the test of the tunics had lost his heart to Laufey, now proposed for her hand. After the festivities were over, he and his fair bride returned to his island, and great were the rejoicings that the kingdom was again under the rule of a just and kind sovereign. He and Laufey reigned long and happily, and visits were often interchanged between them and Prince Tellus and his bride Lineik, who in time became known as the wisest and best among all the rulers of Greece. The Five Brothers. Once upon a time, long years ago, when giants still lived upon the earth, there dwelt an old man and his wife in a small wooden hut sheltered from the rough winter winds by the tall mountains and rocks that surrounded it. The world would have said they were very poor, but they thought themselves rich, for they had 5 handsome, healthy boys who were the delight of their eyes. There was only a year's difference in age between the lads, and they were always together. One day, the old couple went to cut grass on a slope some distance off, leaving the boys alone at home. It was a bright, warm morning, and, tired of playing indoors, the children went out into the little garden, and soon their merry shouts were heard echoing from the hills. Presently up the path towards them came an old woman, feeble and lame. "May an old woman beg for a draught of water?" she said in a weak voice. Stopping their gains at once, the eldest boy ran to the well, while the others made her sit down by the door and rest. In a moment he was back with a pitcher of cool, sparkling water. "There, Granny," he said, "that will refresh you. I let the bucket run down ever so far, to make the water nice and cold." The old dame thanked him heartily, and, having quenched her thirst, asked what their names were. The boys laughed merrily. "We have no names," they said. "We are all so near in age that we do everything together, and when father or mother want anything, they just call out, 'Boys,' and there we are, always at hand." "You have kind hearts," the old woman said. "You are good to the aged and feeble. I was nearly dying of thirst, and could not have gone further without your help. Would that I could reward you as I should like. Alas, I have not the power, but one thing I can do for you. You shall no longer be nameless. I am going to bestow a name on each. You, my young cup-bearer," turning to the eldest boy, "shall be called Watch well, your brothers, Hold well, Hit well, Spy well, and Climb well. May these names in the future bring you good fortune as a reward for your kindness to a poor old woman." Then she bade them good-bye, reminded them once more of their names, told them to act up to them, and turned away down the path. In the evening, when their parents returned, the boys related what had occurred and repeated the strange names they had been given. The old people were much astonished, and asked where the stranger had come from, and all particulars about her. But the boys could only tell what had happened, and the whole thing would soon have been forgotten had it not been for the names. These they did not forget, and, strange to say, the more they were used, the more the owner of each name seemed to develop the special quality that his name denoted, Watchwell, in addition, constituting himself the general guardian of the 5. Was there a burden to carry, Holdwell's strong arms were ready. Did the parents require faggots for the winter, Hitwell would cut a pile up in the dark pine woods on the mountains that gladdened their hearts. Not a rabbit or bird could escape the keen eyes of Spywell, and by constant practice little Climewell could scale the steepest cliffs along the fjord. Years rolled on. The bright boys had grown up into tall, handsome young men, and all this time they had never crossed the high rocky hills that walled in their valley, never seen the great world that lay outside. But now that they were men, a great wish was rising in their hearts to go forth from the old home and play their part among other men. The old people gave them their blessing and bade them continue to stand by one another as they had ever done, for if they only did that, there was nothing they could not achieve. And so the young men departed, following the steep track over the high mountains at first, and then gradually leaving the hill country behind them as they went ever onwards. Sometimes they rested at a farmhouse, sometimes in a village, but nowhere did they find any permanent work. Many a farmer would gladly have engaged Watchwell and Spywell to guard his flocks, but he had no employment for Holdwell and Climewell, and when the two last could have joined the village lads in fishing or seabird hunting, there was, again, no post for the other three. Still, they would not be discouraged. They had stout hearts and strong limbs, and the good fortune they sought must be found elsewhere. So on they went, climbing high mountains and fording swift rivers, till at last they entered an interminable dark pine wood with a tangled undergrowth of brambles and tall ferns. Hitwell cleared a path before them, and at length they emerged on a vast plain. The sun was setting, and pouring a flood of crimson, gold, and purple over the scene before them. The rays lit up the tall spires and high gray walls of a large city, and turned the broad, flowing river that encircled it into molten gold. The brothers stood still entranced. "It must be the city of the king!" cried Watchwell at length. "Yes," said Spywell. "Look, there's the royal flag flying on the tower of the palace." They soon traversed the plain, and as darkness began to fall, they arrived at the great drawbridge over the river and were directed to the palace by the warder. The king received them and listened to their request for employment in his service. The brothers were such fine, handsome fellows that he was much taken with them as they stood before him. They were very tall and had bright blue eyes and fair curling hair. He told them that he could give employment to all five if they would remain throughout the winter at his court and watch and guard his daughters at the coming Christmas Eve. Do not, however, pledge yourselves to stay until you learn the nature of the task that lies before you, he said. For I have made a vow that the life of the next man who fails in this duty shall be forfeited. Perhaps you 5 brothers acting together can be more careful than strangers. Now listen. 2 years ago, he went on, I had 5 fair daughters, but, alas, the Christmas before last my golden-haired Elma disappeared mysteriously in the dead of night. Search was made in all directions. No trace of her could be found. Last Christmas Eve, the princess's apartments were carefully watched and guarded. No strangers were admitted. Only old and faithful servants were near them. But when morning came, Irene, my second daughter, was nowhere to be found, nor was there any sign of her captor's footsteps near the window of the room where she slept. I have now made a vow, and I shall keep it, but I also offer a reward. He who defends them faithfully this year shall wed the next eldest princess who would without his care have disappeared, and he shall be to me as a son. It will be death or honor. Choose, young men, now, while you are still quite free. "We will stay and guard the princesses," they cried with one voice. "It is a task that will call all our qualities into full play. No robber can escape the eyes of Spywell. Holdwell will act up to his name till Climewell and Hitwell reach him, and Watchwell drew himself up proudly, I will be the one to forfeit my life if we fail." So they remained at the court, and became great favorites with the king, who began to feel almost sorry that he had imposed sentence of death on the man who should fail to defend his daughters. He, therefore, determined to do what he could to make them safe, and caused a great tower to be built on to the palace with thick walls and windows very high up, and here the princesses were to sleep on Christmas Eve. and now the time drew near. As usual, great festivities were held for several days. On the last night, when the dancing and merrymaking were all over, the three princesses, Frida, Ida, and Maya, were led to the tower by the king, attended by their ladies. As they lay down on the big couch, covered with silken embroideries, he bade them a last good night and charged the 5 brothers to guard them with their lives. Then he left the tower, double-locking the great iron door that led into the rest of the castle. All was still. The brothers lay down on a rough bench in the antechamber, but the door of the princess's room was wide open and a lamp was kept burning there. It had been a long and tiring day, and the younger brothers were soon fast asleep, but Watchwell never closed an eye. Wrapped in his long cloak, he leant against the wall and watched. The night drew on. But what was that? He thought he saw a dark shadow slowly approach the window of the princess's room. As he looked, a monstrous hand opened the lattice and stretched out gropingly towards the couch on which the king's daughters lay asleep. Watchwell touched his brothers. In an instant, Holdwell had grasped the mysterious hand so tightly that the owner could not move it, and Hitwell, with one blow of his sword, severed it from the wrist. A terrible wild cry of pain and baffled anger filled the air, and, looking forth, the brothers saw a fearful giant striding rapidly away from the palace and shaking his remaining hand threateningly towards the tower. The noise had aroused the king, who was quickly on the spot, while Watchwell and his brothers hurried after the monster. Faster and faster he went, seeing he was pursued, but, though he was speedily out of sight, Spywell's keen eye traced his footsteps all the way. On they went, till at last they came to the foot of a high mountain. Steep and precipitous before them, the sides rose up, no foothold to be seen anywhere. Climwell, however, never hesitated. He showed his brothers a strong silken cord that he always carried with him. Then, making a bold spring to a tiny ledge he had noticed, he commenced to climb, never taking a false step till he reached the summit in safety. Then, lowering the silken rope, he drew up his brothers one after the other. When they reached the top, they found an enormous cavern, and just inside the entrance sat a huge giantess on a low stool, crying bitterly. The brothers asked what ailed her. "What matters it to you?" she said, and cried more than ever. But at last she told them that the previous night her husband had lost one of his hands, and she feared he would die. He was in such terrible pain. Then they told her that they could heal her husband if she would let them in, but no one, they said, must be there but ourselves. We must bind all others, lest they should find out the secret of our healing power. The giantess, who was quite as wicked as her husband, and had hoped to entice these young men by her pretended grief into the cavern so as to provide a dinner for herself and her husband, did not at all like the suggestion of being bound. But she thought, perhaps, they might be able to heal her husband first, so she submitted for the moment, comforting herself with the hope that she could easily break the rope and set herself free when the young men had cured her husband. Holdwell bound her with Climwell's strong silken rope, and then they passed into the inner cavern. The giant was lying on his couch and gave a howl of rage when he saw them. But, crippled by the loss of his hand, he was no match for the young men, who speedily put an end to him. Then they also killed the wicked giantess, who had quite a heap of human bones beside her, and proceeded to explore the inner cavern. They thought it might perhaps contain some hidden treasure, but nothing was to be found, and they were on the point of leaving when Spywell descried a small door cunningly let into the rock. Speedily breaking it open, a subterranean passage was seen, leading to another cavern, and there they discovered the 2 lost princesses. Elma, very pale and emaciated, whilst Irene, who had not been in prison so long, was more rosy and not so thin. The giant had evidently intended securing all 5 princesses before eating them. The king's daughters were greatly overjoyed when they saw their noble deliverers, and heard that they were prisoners no longer. They quickly departed, spy well and climb well, having discovered an easier road for them to return by. They arrived at the palace as night was falling, and the joy of the king at having his 5 daughters united once more can well be imagined. A great banquet was hastily prepared, and before the assembled nobles and guests he related the brave deeds of Watchwell and his brothers, and announced that he had decided to wed his 5 daughters to the 5 heroes. "It is but right and fitting that men such as these, brave, noble, and true, should reign over this land when I am gone," he said, "and to whom could I more worthily entrust my dear daughters than to those who have saved their lives?" Never was there so magnificent a wedding feast. It lasted a whole month, and the dresses of the 5 princesses were perfect marvels of gold and silver embroidery and precious stones. Then to each brother was appointed a position in the state which would call his special quality into play. They lived long and happily with their respective wives, greatly beloved and honored by all. And when at length the old king died, Watchwell succeeded to the throne, and his wise and good reign, together with his beautiful and beloved Queen Elma, is still spoken of to this day. Hermod and Hadvar are. In the days long ago there lived a king and queen. They had an only child called Hadvar, who was not only the heiress to the crown, but was also the most beautiful maiden ever seen. Now the king and queen, having no son of their own, had adopted the child of a friend. The boy was called Hermod. He was about the same age as Hadvar, and equally well skilled in all knowledge that pertains to a young prince. The young people had played together ever since they could remember anything, and the friendship of their childhood only strengthened as they grew older, and they promised to continue true to one another, no matter what might happen. When they were about 18 years old, the good queen sickened, and, feeling that her end was drawing near, she called the king to her bedside. "Dear husband," she said, "I feel I have not long to live. Pray, therefore, grant me the last request I shall ever make you. I know how lonely you will be without me, and I hope, therefore, that you will marry again. But if you do, let it be the good Queen of Hetland, who has lately lost her husband, and who, having no children, will love our dear ones as if they were her own." The king, overwhelmed with grief, promised to do as she wished, and the queen died peacefully. For some time the king could think of nothing but the terrible loss he had sustained. At length, however, wearying of his lonely life, he fitted out a ship and went to sea. After sailing along for some days under brilliant sunshine, one morning a thick fog arose. It grew denser and darker, and the sailors could no longer tell which way they were going, when the mist suddenly lifted and they saw land before them. The king ordered a boat to be lowered and was rowed ashore. He then got out alone, telling the men to wait for him. Going quietly along, he presently came to a wood, and the sun being very hot and the king very tired, he was glad to sit down and rest under the shade of a big oak tree. He had not been long there, however, when he heard music in the distance, and, following the sound, he presently came to a beautiful open glade, and there he saw 3 women. One of them, clad in richly embroidered robes, was seated on a golden stool. She held a harp in her hand, and had evidently been playing, but she looked sad and troubled. Beside her, seated on a lower stool, was a young girl, also handsomely dressed, though not so richly as the elder women, and behind them stood another girl, also good-looking, but very plainly dressed, with a green cloak thrown round her. She evidently was the servant of the other 2. After gazing at the women for a few moments, the king stepped forward and saluted them respectfully. The lady seated on the golden stool, having returned his greeting, asked him who he was and where he was going. "Alas," said the king, "I have lost my dear queen, and now, in accordance with her last wish, I am on my way to Hetland to ask the widowed queen of that country to become my wife." "O king," replied the lady, "how wonderful is the hand of fate! I am the queen you are in search of." Hetland has been overrun by Vikings who burned and destroyed everything they did not carry off, and it was only by a miracle that I managed to escape with my daughter and my attendant here." When the king heard this, he hesitated no longer, but at once offered to take her back as his bride. After a slight hesitation, the lady accepted the king's offer, and, having rested a little longer, the king led the way back to the boat. They quickly embarked and, without any further adventures, arrived at the king's country, where a great wedding feast was immediately prepared, and the marriage took place amid great rejoicing. For some little time matters went very smoothly. Hermod and Hadvor kept much to themselves, leaving the queen and her daughter to enjoy all the splendor and gaiety of the court. But as time went on, Hadvor, who was always kind to those about her, seeing that Olaf, the queen's attendant, was much neglected and snubbed by her mistress, took compassion on her and often asked Olaf to come and see her. After some months, a war broke out with one of the neighboring countries, and the king had to go forth at the head of his army. No sooner had he sailed than the queen went to Hermod and told him she wished him to marry her daughter. "That I cannot do," replied Hermod, "for I love Hadvor, and she alone shall be my wife." Then the queen, finding that no persuasion and no threats had any effect, got very angry. "If you will not marry my daughter," she cried angrily, "neither shall you wed Hadvor. I have not forgotten the magic taught me by my mother, and, as you will not obey me, I lay my spell on you. You shall live on a desert island, and all day long you shall roam about in the shape of a lion. Only after sunset shall you return to your human form, and then you shall think of Hadvor and remember your former life, and thus suffer doubly in looking back on the past. And you shall not be freed from this enchantment till Hadvor succeeds in burning your lion's skin." "I am in your power now," replied Hermod, "but your punishment will overtake you ere long, for I also possess some magic gifts, and though I am at present powerless, as soon as your wicked spell is broken, which it assuredly will be, you and your daughter, who is as wicked as you are, shall be turned into a rat and a mouse, and you will bite and tear each other till you kill one another." So Hermod suddenly disappeared, and no one knew what had become of him. The queen made a pretense of sending out people to search for him, but no trace of him was found. When Olaf next visited Hadvor, she found her in great grief at Hermod's disappearance. "Nay, do not weep," she said. "The queen, by her wicked enchantments, has caused him to disappear for a time. Both she and her daughter are two wicked giantesses who have only assumed their present form, and, when Hermod refused to marry her daughter, she put in practice her magic arts. She has transported him to a desert island, where he will be a lion during the day, but resume his own form every evening, and this charm will last until you succeed in burning the lion's skin. The queen has also further arranged that you are to marry her brother, a terrible three-headed giant who lives underground. I, too, have suffered from her arts," concluded Olaf. "She carried me away from my parents' house, forcing me to serve her. Fortunately, however, she is powerless to hurt me, for the green cloak I always wear over my dress was a gift from my godmother, and nothing can harm me while I have it on. Poor Hadvor. She felt very hopeless when she heard of all her stepmother's wicked plots against her, and entreated Olaf, by the love they bore each other, to assist her. This Olaf gladly promised she would do. But first you must keep watch and guard against the queen's brother," she said. "He lives in a cave beneath the castle, and will rise beneath your chamber some night. You must, therefore, always keep a large pot of boiling pitch ready, and as soon as you hear a great rumbling noise, like an earthquake, and see the ground cracking, at once pour the boiling pitch down the cracks, and this will kill the giant. It is the only thing that can hurt him." About this time the king returned home from the wars, and was greatly distressed at Hermod's disappearance. He made inquiries and sent out messengers in all directions, but no trace of him could be found, and the queen had to use all her arts to console the king under the loss of his adopted son. Hadvar, meanwhile, remained quietly in her own house. Following Olaf's advice, she kept ready the boiling pitch for the giant and had not long to wait. One night, shortly after the king's return, she was suddenly awakened by a loud rumbling noise. The ground began to shake and tremble, but Hadvar, having been fully prepared, was not frightened and summoned her maidens to assist her. Then, as the noises grew louder and several great cracks appeared in the floor, Hadvar and the girls poured the boiling pitch down the open seams. Then gradually the noises ceased, till everything was perfectly quiet again. The next morning the queen rose up early, and as soon as she was dressed she hurried to Princess Hadvar's house. There, lying on the ground outside, she saw the dead body of her brother the giant. "Oh!" cried the queen angrily, "that must be Hadvar's work. But the minx need not think she shall go unpunished and upset all my schemes." And bending over the body of the uncouth monster, she continued, "By my magic power I will that your body shall be transformed into that of a beautiful prince, and that Hadvar shall be accused of causing your death." With these words she placed her hand on the giant's body, and immediately it was changed into the likeness of a handsome prince. The queen then returned to the palace and, pretending to weep, she told the king that she feared his daughter was a very wicked girl, though she always seemed so good, for that her brother, a brave and handsome prince, had come to ask Hadvar's hand in marriage, who without any rhyme or reason had caused him to be killed, for she, the queen, had just seen his dead body lying outside the princess's house. When the king heard this, he hastened to Hadvar's house, accompanied by the queen. And when he saw the dead body lying there, just as the queen had described, he was very angry. He said he could not have wished for a handsomer or nobler son-in-law, and that he would gladly have consented to the marriage. Then the queen begged that she might be allowed to choose Hadvar's punishment, and the king, greatly incensed with his daughter, gave his consent. So the queen said it would only be a just punishment that Hadvar, who had killed her brother, should be buried alive in the same grave with him. And the king, though sorry for his daughter, having given his royal word, said the queen's wishes must be carried out. Olaf, meanwhile, who, unknown to the queen, had overheard all that passed, hastened away to tell Hadvar. When the princess heard what the queen intended doing, she was very frightened, but Olaf comforted her and promised to help her. "And remember, if you wish to bring Hermod back again, you must not mind undergoing some pain and suffering for him." Olaf then brought her a short cloak, which she told Hadvar she must wear over her dress when she went into the grave or burial mound. "The giant," she said, "would be a spirit after he was buried. He will then ask you to cut off and give him one of your hands," continued Olaf, "but you must not promise to do this until he has told you where Hermod is and how you are to get to him. Then when you want to get out of the grave, he will let you mount on his shoulder, but beware how you trust him. He will only help you to put you off your guard, and will take hold of your cloak and drag you back. See, therefore, that it is only loosely tied, so that when once you have your foot on the outer edge, the cloak alone will remain in his hands." Meanwhile the grave was being prepared, and when all was ready, the body of the supposed prince was laid in it, and Hadvar, who was not allowed to say a word in her own defense, was lowered in beside him, and the grave was walled up and closed. And then all happened as Olaf had foretold. The supposed prince became a spirit, but in his former giant form, and asked Hadvar if she would let him cut off one of her hands and her hair, saying, "Only a maiden's hand will open the grave, and a maiden's hair will Hermod save." But Hadvar refused unless he first told her where Hermod was, and how she could get to him. Then the giant said that the queen had banished Hermod to a desert island, and described exactly where it was. "But you will not be able to reach him unless you cut off your hand," said the giant. "Then you must cut off your hair and plait it together and make it into sandals, and with these you will be able to cross both sea and land." Hadvar at once carried out the giant's instructions. She cut off her beautiful long golden hair, and plaiting it together made herself a pair of sandals. Then, thinking only of Hermod, bravely held out her hand for the giant to cut off, and declared she was ready to go. The giant said he would help her, that she must climb upon his shoulder and touch the roof with the hand he had cut off, when the top of the grave would open. So she followed his directions, and no sooner was the grave open than the giant stretched up his hand and caught hold of her cloak to pull her back. But with one spring Hadvar was outside the grave. The cloak slipped from her shoulders, remaining in the giant's hands, and, without waiting to look round, she flew along the road he had told her of. She ran on for some time without venturing to stop or look round, until at length she reached the seashore. There, far, far away in the distance, she saw a high, rocky island. Her sandals, however, enabled her to cross the water easily, but when she reached the island, the shore was so steep and rocky she could find no way of getting into the interior. This was a terrible disappointment, and tired and weary with all she had gone through, Hadvar sat down on a fallen piece of rock and presently fell asleep. Then she dreamt that a big giantess came up to her and said, "I know that you are Hadvar, the king's daughter, and that you are in search of Hermod. He is on this island, but you will not find it easy to reach him if left to yourself, for the cliffs are steep and dangerous, and, though you are brave and ready to face any danger for him, you will not be able to climb them. But I will help you. Go round the corner of the next cliff, and there you will find a stout rope fastened to the rocks. By its help you will be able to climb up and get into the island. But it is large and has many caves, and you might be a long time ere you find Hermod. I have therefore brought you this ball of ribbon. Take hold of the loose end, and the ball will roll along and guide you in the right way. I also give you this girdle. Fasten it round your waist, and as long as you wear it you will suffer neither hunger nor fatigue. But remember to keep silence while Hermod is still under the spell, and on no account must you speak until after you have burnt the lion's skin." When Hadvar awoke, feeling quite strong and refreshed, she thought she had only had a very pleasant dream, but, looking round, she saw a ball of gaily colored ribbon and a beautiful silken girdle lying beside her. Putting the girdle round her waist, she tucked the ball inside of it, and, going round the next cliff, she saw a stout rope hanging down. Then she knew that her dream was no ordinary one. She took hold of the rope and began climbing the almost perpendicular rock. But it was a long and difficult task, for the rocks were high and steep, and the loss of her hand greatly impeded her progress. But whenever she lost heart, she thought of Hermod, and the knowledge that she was at last near him gave her fresh strength, till at length she reached the top. She then placed the ball on the ground and followed its lead, till it stopped at the entrance to a cave. Cautiously Hadvar peeped in, but she saw nothing except a miserable wooden pallet, so she crept under this and hid herself. The hours seemed very long as she lay there listening for every sound that might announce Hermod's approach. Then, just as the sun was setting, sending a bright crimson gleam into the cave, she heard a loud roar, accompanied by heavy footsteps, and presently a huge lion entered the cave. Hadvar's heart leapt into her mouth, but she remembered that she must be silent if she wished to save him. The lion then went towards the hearth, and giving himself a vigorous shake, the lion's skin fell off, and Hadvar saw that it was indeed Hermod. He sat down on the bed, little thinking that Hadvar was hid underneath, and began talking aloud of his love for Hadvar, and his great grief at their separation, and his utter inability to help himself. "For, alas," he concluded, "it is only by Hadvar's finding and burning my lion's skin that I can ever get back my human figure and power, and how is it possible she should ever find me here?" Hadvor, when she heard these words, almost jumped out from beneath the bed, but she remembered in time that she must not speak until she had burnt the lion's skin. So, with a strong effort of her will, she kept perfectly still and silent till Hermod threw himself down on the bed. As soon as she heard that he was fast asleep, she crept forth quietly and, taking an armful of wood and a lighted brand from the hearth, she made up a big fire outside the cave and burnt the lion's skin Hermod had thrown off. She then returned to the cave and wakened Hermod. What a glad and joyful meeting that was! Hadvor told Hermod all that had occurred after his disappearance, and how, by Olaf's help, she had been enabled to find him. "Oh, Hadvor," cried Hermod, "to think of all you have done and suffered for my sake, and alas that you should have lost your right hand. How can I ever make up to you for all you have done?" And gently taking the maimed arm, he pressed his lips to the wrist, when lo and behold, the hand was restored, and not even a mark was visible to show where it had been severed. Then they began planning how best to return home, and Hadvor told Hermod of her wonderful dream and the gifts she had already received from the giantess. "Surely," she added, "she must live somewhere on this island and might help us again." Hermod said he believed a giantess did live on the island, and that she was called Allgood, but he had never seen her, though she was supposed to watch over people and help them. So they determined to try and find her, and they sallied forth. After a long search they came to a huge cavern, inside of which sat the great giantess, surrounded by her 15 children. Then Hermod asked her if she would help them to return to their home, telling her how they had been driven forth. "It will not be easy," replied Allgood, "because the giant who was buried with Hadvor will try and throw all kinds of obstacles in your way. He has been changed into a huge whale and swims all round this island, and he will certainly try all he can to kill Hadvor ere she reaches her own country. But I will lend you my ship, for though Hadvor's sandals would carry you across the water, they will not protect you from the giant. He may not know that you are in my ship, but if you see him swimming towards you, I fear your life may be in danger. Then call on me, and I will help you." Hermod and Hadvor thanked the giantess warmly for her good advice and kind offer of help, and getting on board her ship, where they found food and everything they wanted, they left the island, happy and hopeful. But ere long they saw a huge whale swimming rapidly towards them. He spouted the water up yards high, and lashed the sea with his tail as he came near the ship. "O Hermod," cried Hadvor, "that surely must be the wicked giant. Let us call on Allgood to help us." And they both called loudly on the giantess for aid. Immediately, a still bigger whale than the first one appeared, followed by 15 smaller ones. They swam swiftly towards the ship, and when they had completely surrounded it, they turned on the first whale. Then a terrific battle began. The water shot almost up to the clouds. The sea was lashed into such great waves that it seemed as if the vessel must be swamped, and Hermod and Hadvor watched eagerly for the result. The fight lasted for some time, but when at length it was over, they saw that the sea for some distance was red with the blood of the dead whale. And then the big whale, followed by the 15 smaller ones, swam back to the island, and Hermod and Hadvor reached their own land in safety. Meanwhile, strange events had happened at the king's castle. The queen and her daughter had disappeared, and in their apartments a big rat and a mouse fought all day and night. In vain the servants tried to drive them away. Even if they ran off for a short time, they always came back again and disturbed the whole castle by their cries. Thus some time passed, and the king was once again plunged into grief, not only at the disappearance of the queen, but because these horrid animals left neither him nor his court any peace. One evening, when they were all assembled in the great hall, very sad and silent, quick steps were heard approaching, and, to the surprise of everyone, Hermod entered. As soon as the king saw him, he embraced him warmly, greeting him like one returned from the dead and anxiously inquiring all that had happened to him. But before sitting down, Hermod said he must first go to the queen's apartment. There the rat and mouse were fighting and biting one another, uttering frightful cries, but, drawing his sword, Hermod smote them both when, to the amazement of all, there lay two hideous giantesses dead on the ground. The servants quickly carried them out into the great courtyard, where they were thrown on a pile of wood and burnt. Meanwhile the king and Hermod, accompanied by the whole court, returned to the hall, and then Hermod related all his wonderful adventures, greatly to the delight and amazement of the king and his courtiers. And while they were exclaiming at the wonders of his tale, Hadvor came in, accompanied by Olaf. Then, indeed, there was general rejoicing, and the king at once acceded to Hermod's wish to become his son-in-law. There was no long delay over the wedding, and as the king was now growing old, he handed over the government of the country to Hermod, whose reign is still known as that of the Good King. Hadvor, in the midst of her own happiness, did not forget Olaf and all the good services she had rendered her. She married one of the great nobles of the kingdom, who became King Hermod's right hand, and Hadvor and Olaf remained close friends all the days of their life, their friendship descending to their children and grandchildren. Ingrg. There once lived a king and queen who ought to have been as happy as the day is long, for they had a fine kingdom, a beautiful palace, plenty of horses and carriages. Their treasure room was filled with gold, silver, and precious stones, and no matter how much they took out of it, it always remained full. Their people were quiet and industrious, and they had no cares or troubles. Yet, notwithstanding all this, they grew daily more sad and sorrowful, for they had no children to inherit all the riches they owned. One day the queen went out into the palace garden. It was a fine, bright winter's morning. The snow lay hard and firm on the ground, and each tree and bush sparkled and glistened in the sunshine, just as if the jewels in the king's treasury had been scattered over them. The queen, feeling tired, sat down on a stone bench beneath a huge oak tree, when suddenly a large white bird flew down from the tree. It brushed past so close to the queen's face that the wing feathers scratched her cheek, and a few drops of bright crimson blood fell on the snowy ground. "Oh," cried the queen, "would that I might have a daughter who would be as beautiful as those crimson drops on the white glistening ground." "You shall have your wish," sang the bird as it flew away, its white wings shining in the sun like silver. The queen had hardly recovered from her surprise than she heard a noise behind her, and, turning round, she beheld the old man Surtur, who lived in a little hut near the palace, and who was well known and dreaded as a wicked magician. "Aye, you shall have your wish," he muttered in a fierce, angry voice, "but I too intend to have a say in the matter. A daughter shall indeed be born to you, but she shall cause you more sorrow than happiness, unless indeed she returns you good for evil." And he laughed wickedly and disappeared. When the queen heard these words, she was greatly troubled, for she knew that Surtur was her enemy, and that he was powerful. But as weeks and months passed and nothing happened, she forgot all about the old man's words, and when at length her little daughter was born, everyone agreed that she was the most beautiful child ever seen. She was christened Ingebjörg, and grew up as good as she was beautiful. At first the queen could not do enough for the child, and could hardly bear her out of her sight, but as she grew older, and when she saw how fond the king was of Ingebjörg, and how everyone praised and admired her, she began to grow jealous, and all her love seemed to turn to hatred. When the king saw this, he thought it would be better to separate Ingebjörg from her mother, so he built her a separate house, and there she lived with her own attendants. But this only made the queen still more angry. At last she fell ill and sent for her daughter, and when the girl came to her bedside she whispered something in her ear, and then sent her back to her own house again. But from that day a change came over Ingebjörg. She no longer laughed and danced as was her wont, but walked about the rooms alone, often weeping, and would never leave her house on any pretext whatsoever. One day, when Ingebjorg, as usual, sat in her room, her work that she used to take such pleasure in lying idly on her lap, while the tears rolled slowly down her cheeks, she heard someone knocking at the door, and on opening it she saw a funny little old woman with a high-peaked hat, who asked if she might come in and rest. Ingebjorg listlessly said, "Yes." And then the old woman began telling her some wonderful stories, and at last Ingebjorg got so interested that her tears stopped, and she looked quite bright and happy like her old self. "And now," continued the old woman, "I want you to come out into the wood with me. It is a lovely day, and so beautiful and fresh in the shade of the trees." Though at first Ingebjorg declared she did not care to go, she at last allowed herself to be persuaded, and soon they were wandering along on the soft, mossy paths beneath the beautiful great tall-stemmed firs, graceful beeches, and feathery birch, till gradually the sad look disappeared from Ingebjorg's face, and she began to laugh and run like the happy girl she had once been. "And now," said the little old woman, when, tired of walking, they had seated themselves on a mossy bank, "now tell me, Ingebjorg, why are you always so sad?" At first the girl refused to speak, but the little old woman kept on asking, and she looked so kind and gentle that at length Ingebjorg said her mother had told her that it had been foretold at her birth that she was to marry a terrible giant, and that she was to burn her father's castle and so cause his death. "And oh," cried Ingebjorg, "I love him so dearly. He has always been so good and kind to me. Oh, let us hasten home. I quite forgot. I ought never to have left my house, and I never will go out again, and then I cannot possibly harm him or marry that horrible giant." And the poor girl hurried home, sobbing and crying all the way. "Nay, nay," said the little old woman. "Comfort yourself, my child. I am your godmother, and there is no harm done, and I think we can find some way to avert these evils. It is all that wicked Surtur's doing. He wanted to marry your mother, and when she would have nothing to say to him and married your father, he vowed he would never rest till the king was dead and she was punished. So he got her maid to give her some drops made out of the dragon's tooth, which turned her love for you to hatred and jealousy. But he can only work so far. It remains for you, now that you are grown up, to undo the evil he has wrought by returning good for evil, for love can overcome all things." The king's palace. "I cannot save, for my power only extends over living things, but neither your father nor mother shall be hurt, and the treasure can also be saved. Neither need you fear the giant if you will do exactly as I bid you. Now you must first go and persuade your father to go out riding in the forest with all his attendants." With a heart greatly relieved at her godmother's cheery words, Ingebjorg hastened to do her bidding. "Dear father," she said as she entered his presence, "the day is so fine and the woods are so beautiful. Will you not go out for a ride in the woods and take the courtiers with you?" And the king, pleased at seeing her look so bright and happy, at once said he would go, and with all his courtiers in attendance, started off for a great hunting party in the forest. As soon as they were well out of sight, Ingebjorg sent the servants away on different errands, and when the palace was quite empty, the little old dame helped the princess to carry out all the treasure and whatever else was of value in the castle. And then, when they stood in the great empty hall, she told Ingebjorg that she must now take down the big can of oil from the mantel-shelf. In so doing, the girl's foot slipped, and the oil ran over the hearth and into the fire. In a few minutes the whole place was in a blaze, the little old dame and Ingebjorg having just time to escape. "Thus," said the old woman, "one part of old Surtur's enchantment has been fulfilled, without harm to anyone, and the rest you must now carry out." So saying, she gave Ingebjorg a little silver ball. "Now go to the forest, throw down this ball, and follow its windings till it stops at a woodman's hut. Go in, but keep the door ajar, so that you can see who comes in, and, whatever you do, remember that you must see the owner of the hut before he sees you." Remain there till I summon you, but when in your dreams you hear me calling you, do not lose an instant, but hasten to the palace, for your mother will need you. Remember, love is the great conqueror and can overcome all evils." Ingebjorg promised to do exactly as the old dame had told her. She threw down the silver ball and followed its course as it rolled along, till at last it stopped before a woodman's hut, and, going in, she hid behind the half-closed door, peeping curiously between the slit. Presently she saw a huge giant coming towards the hut, carrying a dead bear across his shoulders which he had killed out hunting. He pushed open the door, and as he threw down his burden he beheld Ingebjorg. However, she had seen him first, and felt very frightened. But though he looked terribly fierce, his voice was very soft and kind as he told her that she might remain with him, but that she would have to make the beds, cook the food, and sweep the floor, all which Ingebjorg promised to do. He then showed her a little inner chamber where he said she might sleep. "And whatever noises you hear," he added, "don't come in here unless I call you." And thus passed 3 days. The giant went out early every morning and never returned till sunset, while Ingebjorg cooked the food, made the beds, and kept the little hut clean and tidy. Every night she heard frightful noises in the outer room. The walls of the hut shook and the earth trembled, but as the giant never called her, she lay quietly in her bed, pulling the clothes over her ears to deaden the terrible noises. And then, as she fell asleep, each night she dreamed that, instead of the giant, a handsome young prince stood beside the hearth. On the 3rd evening, she had hardly fallen asleep when she fancied she heard someone calling her. Quickly jumping out of bed, she hastily threw on her clothes, cautiously opened the door, and, seeing the hut was empty, she ran as quickly as she could to the palace. She knew that her mother needed her. There, in front of the chief entrance, she saw a wooden stake had been driven into the ground, to which the queen was tied, while the servants were piling faggots of wood round her, for the queen had been condemned to be burnt to death for having set the palace on fire during the king's absence, and stolen all the treasure, though she in vain pleaded her innocence. Pushing her way through the crowd, Ingebjorg threw herself down on her knees before her father. "Oh, stop, stop," she cried eagerly. "Dear father, my mother is not to blame. It was I who was forced to burn down the castle in order to save your life, which was threatened by the wicked magician Surtur, and the treasure also is safe." When the king heard this, he at once ordered the queen to be released, who, freed from the wicked spells that Surtur had thrown over her, embraced her daughter with many loving words. Surtur, hearing that his evil deeds were known to the king, tried to hide himself in the woods, but he was caught and brought back by the giant, who had also fallen under his enchantments. But Ingebjorg remembered her silver ball, and, throwing it towards the giant, he caught it, and as he did so he was immediately changed into the handsome young prince Ingebjorg had seen each night in her dreams. But Surtur was not to escape. The king called his servants, who bound the magician with strong cords. He was condemned to death for all his wicked deeds, and was led forth into the desert, where he was torn to pieces by wild horses. All the queen's old jealousy now died out forever. She loved Ingebjorg more fondly each day, and before long there was a great marriage feast between the prince and Ingebjorg. They lived happily together all the days of their life, and on the death of the king and queen, Ingebjorg and her husband reigned in their stead, beloved by all their people. Hans. Chapter 5. The spell is broken, and the wicked queen's designs are frustrated. The following morning the sun shone out bright and clear, and everyone declared no happier omen could usher in so auspicious a day. But when the queen went to her daughter's room to waken her, in place of dark Isolde, there lay a hideous dwarf in the bed. "Oh, Isolde," cried the queen, wringing her hands, "what can we do? How was it possible that we both forgot that this is the one morning in the year on which you must resume your own form? Oh, this is terrible. We must put off the wedding, and say that you are ill."
No, no,
croaked the misshapen figure.
if we once let Fertram off, I know he will never marry me.
The queen remained lost in thought for a few minutes. Then she exclaimed, I know what we will do. I will get Nefracola, the sewing girl. She is just your height and size. I will dress her as the bride, and under the thickly embroidered veil no one will notice the difference. Then, after the whole party come back from their ride, you will have resumed your own pretty face and figure. You can then change with Nefracola, and none will be any the wiser. But will not Nefracola talk about it or object? Asked the dwarf. Neither she herself nor anyone else will know anything about it, replied the queen. You leave it all to me. In a short time the queen went to Nefracola's room and brought her a hot cup of coffee. Drink this, she said. I am sure you must be wearied out with all the work you have done, and this will be a tiring day for you. Though Nefracola was not thirsty, she did not like to refuse the queen, thinking she really meant it kindly, but no sooner had she swallowed the coffee than she seemed to fall into a sort of trance. It seemed to her as if she were Isolde again, and that this was her own wedding day. She was dressed in the bridal garments, and the richly embroidered veil was thrown over her. Then, after the wedding ceremony was over, the whole bridal party went for a ride through the forest. It all seemed like a strange dream to the girl. As they passed the blackened ruins of Isolde's tower, Nefracola murmured, Once thou wert bright and fair, now thou art burnt, O chamber mine. Fertram bent forward on his horse and asked her what she had said, but she gave him no answer. Shortly after they came to a big lime tree whose sweet blossoms scented the whole air, and Nefracola murmured, Behold this giant linden tree, beneath whose shade Fertram and Isolde plighted their troth forever and aye. And he will hold to it yet. After riding some little distance further, they came to the deep trench. Looking down into it, Nefracola murmured, But for my dear mother's golden gifts, here would my life have ended. Once again Fertram asked her what she had said, but still she remained silent. At last, just as the sun was setting, they returned to the palace. Nefracola dismounted and went up to her own room, but scarcely had she sat down than a sudden giddiness seized her. All grew dark before her eyes, and she lost consciousness. Then the queen, who had been waiting for her, came forth from behind a screen where she had been hidden, and, taking off the bridal garments, she hastened with them to Dark Isolde's room. The latter had now regained her fair form, and was quickly robed in the rich garments of the bride, after which the queen returned to Nefracola and dressed her in her usual dress. Presently Fertram came for Isolde, and, sitting down beside her, asked her what she had said during the ride, when they passed the ruins of her tower. I really cannot remember what I said, replied Isolde. But you must tell me, said Fertram. Then Isolde went to her mother and asked her what Nefracola could have said. So the queen told her, and Isolde returned to Fertram and repeated the words. But he felt strangely dissatisfied. I should also like to know what it was you said when we passed beneath the great lime tree, and when we came to that deep trench in the forest. I really cannot recollect all I said, replied Dark Isolde crossly. I am sure it was nothing of any importance. Nay, but I insist upon knowing, said Fertram. You seem so strange, and not at all like yourself. You must tell me. So Isolde once again went to her mother, and the queen said that when they came to the great linden tree, Nefracola had said, Behold the giant linden tree, beneath whose shade Fertram and Isolde plighted their troth forever, and Isolde plighted their troth forever and aye. And he will hold to it yet. And that when they arrived at the deep trench, she murmured, But for my dear mother's golden gifts, here would my life have ended. When Dark Isolde returned to Fertram with these answers, she thought, Surely now he must be satisfied. But all these replies had just the opposite effect, for the more he heard, the more strange and startling did it all appear to him. "Oh, my lost fair Isolde," he cried, "would that I could learn the truth of all this." Then suddenly it seemed as if a veil were lifted from his memory. He recollected all his love for his cousin, fair Isolde, and how different she was in every way to the dark maiden beside him. "O Isolde, my own fair princess," he cried, "would that I could see you once again and hold you to my heart. But as you are dead, and this is not possible, may I also die and so be with you." Scarcely had these words passed his lips when a soft light suddenly filled the room, and lo! In the open doorway stood his own fair cousin, more sweet and beautiful than ever. Stretching out her arms towards him, she said, "O Fertram, your love and faithfulness have conquered and overcome the wicked spells of my stepmother. If you indeed are still true to me, we may yet defeat her, and all will be well." "Isolde, my own Isolde," cried Fertram, "can it really be you, or is it only your spirit, and are you not dead, as they solemnly assured me?" And he drew her lovingly towards him. At this moment the queen rushed into the room, speedily followed by the king. When she saw that her wicked scheme had fallen through, she gave a great scream which shook the whole palace. In an instant she was changed back into the wicked giantess she had originally been, and her daughter, who was behind her, became again the ugly little dwarf. The king, in his anger at the terrible deception that had been practiced on him, wanted then and there to order them to be instantly killed, but, at fair Isolde's petition, they were sent back to their own island, and bound never to quit it on pain of instant death. Then a fresh, and, this time, a very merry wedding feast was ordered, which was much more magnificent than the last one. The tables were laden with peacocks roasted, and peacocks spiced, with fishes boiled and fishes fried, with mimjam and pimjam and multum salve. The wine that was drank was primate and claret, as well as the wine of Garganus. Then all the guests, ere their departure, were laden with presents from the king's treasure house, and when, after some years, the old king was gathered to his fathers, Fertram and Isolde reigned jointly, and lived long and happily, seeing their children and great-great-grandchildren around them. Prince Highline. In a far country there once lived a king and a queen. They had an only son called Helini, who even as a child showed wonderful talents, and grew up the handsomest, cleverest, and bravest man in all the land. One day the prince went out hunting with some of the courtiers. It was a beautiful morning. The sun shone with unusual brilliancy. Birds and game of all kinds were plentiful, and, well pleased with their good day's sport, the whole party turned homewards, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, when suddenly a thick fog arose, which soon, only with great difficulty, that they made their way back to the castle. When the king heard that his son had not returned, he became very anxious, and the fog having somewhat lifted, he at once sent out messengers to try and find him. But although they searched in all directions for 3 days and nights, they could find no trace of him. No one had heard of or seen Prince Heine. This sudden disappearance of his son greatly grieved the king, and when, on the evening of the 3rd day, the messengers returned without any news of him, the king retired to his room, and, throwing himself on his bed, gave way to the deepest grief. In vain the queen tried to cheer him, telling him that Helini was so brave and clever he would be sure to return safely. The king would not be consoled, and said he would gladly give the half of his kingdom to anyone who would bring him back his son. Now, not far from the palace, in the middle of a wild moor covered with yellow gorse and purple heather, there lived an old man in a little cottage with his only child, a daughter called Signy, who was both beautiful and clever. They were very poor, but lived happily and contented on wild honey and the berries that grew on the moors. When Signy heard from the shepherds that the prince had disappeared, and that the king had offered the half of his kingdom to whoever should find him, she begged her father to let her go in search of him. At first he was very unwilling to part with her, dreading the dangers she might have to encounter, but Signy said she felt quite sure she would succeed in her search. All she wanted was a pair of new shoes and some food. And so, after a little more persuasion, her father gave her his blessing and started her on her journey. Signy wandered on for several days, resting in the evenings in some sheltered nook, and ever going towards the north. It was now midsummer. The days were long. In fact, there was scarcely any night, and on the fourth evening, just as the sun, like a huge red ball, was setting in a bed of crimson and gold, only to rise again, Signy saw some rocks in front of her, in one of which was a huge cave. Listening carefully for a few minutes and hearing no sound, Signy entered very softly, and there she saw two beds. One was covered with a beautiful blue silk quilt embroidered with gold, the other had a crimson velvet quilt embroidered with silver. Going cautiously forward, she saw the prince lying fast asleep on the bed with the golden quilt. Signy was delighted with her discovery, and went up to him to waken him, but though she shook him, at first gently and then more roughly, she found she could not rouse him. Looking up, she saw some strange letters, or runes, cut into the wooden headboard of the bed. Now, though her father, who was a learned old man, had taught Signy to read runes, she could make nothing of these. She therefore determined to wait and see who the owner of the cave was, and discovering a narrow recess near the opening, she crept quietly in. Hardly had she got safely into her hiding place than she heard a terrible noise like a peal of thunder. The earth began to quake, and presently two frightful giantesses entered the cave. As they came in, the taller and elder of the two cried out angrily, "Pah! I smell the smell of a human being here." "Of course you do," replied her sister, "seeing that Hlini the king's son is asleep here." They then went to the bed on which Hlini was lying, and moving the headboard, on which the runes were carved, to one side, out came two beautiful silver swans. "Sing, my beautiful swans, sing and waken Hoini," cried the giantesses, and as the swans, obeying, sang a lovely sweet song, the prince awoke. The younger giantess then brought him a silver tray laden with delicious fruit and wine, but the prince would not touch anything. "Will you marry me now?" then asked the giantess. "No, no, and again no," cried the prince. "Then sing, sing, my beautiful swans, that Hlini may go to sleep again," she called out angrily. And as the swans raised their voices in a sad, plaintive melody, the prince fell back on the bed and was soon in his magic sleep again. The two sisters then lay down on the other couch with the silver-embroidered quilt. In the morning they again wakened Hlini in the same manner and offered him food, which, however, he angrily refused, whereupon the younger giantess again asked him if he would marry her, and when he refused, as before, the sisters put him to sleep by the song of the swans, and then left the cave, closing it as they went out. After waiting a little while to make sure that the wicked sisters were not coming back again, Signy came out of her hiding place, and moving the headboard of the bed, as she had seen the sisters do, she called to the swans, and as they sang their song, the prince awoke. He was greatly surprised to see Signy in place of the hideous giant sisters, and thanked her warmly for her help, asking how she had come there. Then Signy told him how much his father sorrowed at his mysterious disappearance, and that she had determined to try and find him. Hlini was very grateful and told Signy that, after he had got separated from his friends in the fog, he had suddenly encountered the giant sisters who, having their swans with them, put him to sleep before he had time to fight them or get away, and that they had then forcibly carried him off to their cave, and that the younger sister, as she had no doubt heard, wanted to marry him. But this he had steadily refused to do. As long as he remained firm, they could only keep him there asleep. But, he added, he would rather remain thus forever than marry the ogress. When he had finished his tale, Signy said, "Now the first thing we must do is to find out the meaning of the runes on the headboard. When, therefore, the sisters come in this evening, do not refuse their food, for you will want all your strength to get away." but be friendly with them, and then ask them what the letters mean, and also what they do all day while they are away." Hlini said he would certainly follow Signy's advice. Then, finding a chessboard and some men on a shelf, they sat down and amused themselves, playing and chatting, till they thought it was drawing near the time when the giantesses usually returned. Then Signy called the swans and put the prince to sleep, as she had seen the sisters do, after which she hid herself in her dark corner. Soon she heard the sisters returning, and presently they entered the cave.
"I certainly do smell the smell of a human being,"
said the elder sister, sniffing angrily round the cave. "Nonsense," replied the younger one, who, having lit the fire, was anxious to get their supper cooked. "Of course you smell it when Hlini is here." "But this is a different smell," persisted the elder sister, and Signy, seeing her peering about, feared she would discover her. But the younger sister, having plucked and cleaned the birds they had caught, told her elder sister she must cook them at once, as she was about to waken Hlini, and, going up to the couch with the gold-embroidered quilt, on which Hlini was lying asleep, she called forth the swans and wakened him. By this time the birds were cooked, and when she asked him if he would take any food, instead of refusing, Hlini said he felt hungry and would join them at their supper. The younger giantess was greatly pleased, and after helping him to fruit and wine, asked him whether he would not now make her his wife. But Hlini said he must first know more about her and her sister before he could decide. "What, for instance, is the meaning of those runes carved on the bedhead?" he asked. "Oh," replied the giantess graciously, "the words are, 'Fly, fly, O bedstead mine, and carry me whither I will.' You have only to sit down on the bed and repeat those words, and immediately you are carried to whatever place you wish to go." The prince was delighted when he heard this, as he hoped it would enable him and Signy to escape. "And what do you and your sister do all day when you are out?" he asked. "Well, we roam about looking for some man, woman, or child for our dinner, for we always prefer them to birds or animals, and then, when we get tired, we sit down under a tree and play with our life egg," replied the giantess. "I suppose you have to be very careful when you are playing with your life egg?" asked the prince. "Yes, indeed we have to be," answered the giantess, "for if it were broken we should both die." "But there is no fear of that." And she gave a loud laugh. "We are much too careful. It can only be broken by a human being, and whenever one of them comes near us, we soon catch him and eat him." The prince now declared that he felt so tired he really must go to sleep, and though, before calling the swans, the giantess again asked him to marry her, he said he could say nothing till the morning, so he was put to sleep as before. The next morning, after the sisters had wakened him and given him some food, they asked him if he would go to the woods with them, but Hlini said he still felt very tired, and would prefer to rest, so the sisters put him to sleep again and went away, closing the cave after them. Waiting a short time, so as to make quite sure that the giantesses would not return, Signy presently came forth from her hiding-place and awakened the prince. "Get up quickly," she said, "for we will follow the giantesses into the wood. Take with you your hunting spear which stands beside the bed, and when they begin to play at throw and catch with their life ball, you must throw your spear at the egg, but keep a clear eye and a firm hand, for, remember, if you miss, both your life and mine will be forfeited." "Never fear," said Hlini. "There is too much at stake. I will be careful." Then they seated themselves on the couch, and both repeated the rune. "Fly, fly, O bedstead mine, and carry me whither I will." And immediately the bed rose up, the wall of the cave opened, and passing swiftly through the air, it landed them amid the leafy branches of a huge oak tree. Peeping cautiously down, they saw the two giantesses sitting at the foot of the tree. One was holding the golden life egg in her hand, ready to throw it at her sister, and both were laughing loudly as the egg flew backwards and forwards between them. Watching his opportunity, Hlini threw his spear just as one sister was poising it in her hand, and as the point of the spear hit the egg, it broke in half. At the same instant, both giantesses fell back dead. A stream of dark-colored poison poured from their lips, and huge, deadly black and yellow fungi sprang up and speedily covered them completely. Pliny then seated himself beside Signy on the couch, and immediately they were carried back to the cave. Here they found, on searching round, an immense quantity of gold, silver, and jewels, and having laden both beds with these and the 2 silver swans, they each sat down on one, and, repeating the runes, were speedily transported to the hut of Signy's father, who was delighted at his daughter's safe return, and made Hlini very welcome. The next morning Signy went to the king's palace and demanded an audience, and the king, having admitted her, asked her who she was and what she wanted. "I am the daughter of the old man who lives in the little hut on the moor near your palace," replied Signy, "and I have come to ask what reward you would give me if I bring your son back to you safe and well." The king laughed good-naturedly. "I do not think I need trouble to answer that," he said. "There is not much chance of your finding him when so many others have failed." "But if I succeed," persisted Signy, "will you give me the same reward as you have promised to others?" "Certainly," replied the king. "If you succeed in bringing back my son safe and well, I will not go back from my word." Then Signy returned to the hut, and begged the prince to return with her to the palace, and together they entered the great audience hall. When the king beheld his son, whom he had mourned as dead, alive and well, he was greatly rejoiced, and made him sit down on his right hand, and relate the story of all that had happened to him since the day he became separated from his friends during the chase. When Hlini seated himself beside the king, he begged Signy to take the seat on his other hand, and then began the relation of all his adventures, telling of his imprisonment in the cave and how Signy had freed him and saved his life by rescuing him from the hands of the wicked giantesses. When he had finished, he rose from his seat, and standing before his father, asked his permission to take Signy as his wife. To this the king willingly assented, saying that no reward could be too great for her, who had restored his son to him. So orders were at once issued for the preparation of a magnificent wedding feast. All the great nobles of the kingdom were invited, neither were the poor forgotten. There was ample provision made for all, and everyone praised the king for his right royal hospitality, for each one received rich gifts ere they returned home. Signy's father was made the king's librarian, and put in charge of the royal manuscripts, and Hlini and Signy lived long and happily together, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Fertram and Hildior. Long, long ago, in a distant land, there lived a king and queen who were quite happy, save for one thing: they had no children. Some years passed, and then, to their great joy, a little baby girl arrived, who was named Hildur. When the christening feast came to an end, the king, who was devoted to hunting, set out with his courtiers for a long day in the great forest which surrounded the castle. Nothing unusual happened until the hunting party began to turn homewards. The king was riding alone, a little in front of his gaily dressed retinue, when he suddenly saw an enormous dragon flying swiftly through the air towards him, holding a small child in his talons. In an instant the king drew his bow. The arrow, shot by his practiced hand, sped to its mark, and the monster fell to the ground, pierced through the heart. The king leapt from his horse, and by the time his courtiers reached his side, he was holding in his arms the rescued child, a beautiful boy of about a year old, quite unhurt. There were plenty of willing arms ready to carry the little fellow, but the king refused. "I rescued him, and now he shall be a playmate for my little daughter," he said. And the whole party went back to the castle. Years passed on. The children grew up together and loved each other dearly. The king and queen had named the little boy Fertram, and they treated him in all respects like their own child. If one of the little ones had a present, the other had the same, and at last they were never happy if they parted even for a day. Now Hilder's grandmother was deeply versed in all kinds of magic arts, and even when the young princess was still quite a girl, she taught her many of her secrets. The child was the one being whom she loved. On the other hand, she had an unreasoning dislike to the boy who had so strangely become part of the family, and when she saw the affection of the young people for one another, she determined to poison Fertram. "Never shall my beloved grandchild wed this foundling boy," she said to herself. "The son of one of our rich neighbors is the mate I destine for her." So she waited for an opportunity. One day Fertram came in very hungry from a long day's hunting. The grandmother caused a dainty dish to be set before him, and begged him to partake of it. But Hildur, who had noticed her grandmother's dislike to the young prince, came in at the moment and, seeing the dish was poisoned, prevented his eating it. Another time the grandmother attempted to kill him as he lay asleep in his bed, but Hildur again divined her intentions. She warned Fertram, and they placed a log of wood in the bed. When night came, the old woman entered, and with a dagger pierced the figure in the bed as she thought, but, to her surprise, the weapon remained firmly fixed in the log, whilst her hands were fastened to the handle, and she had to remain thus until morning broke, when the spell gave way. Twice had Hildur thus been able to save Fertram, but they both saw that he was no longer safe. At any moment the old woman might exercise some magic art and prevent Hildur saving him again. They decided that they must take some other course. One morning early, before even the sleepy guards at the gate were awake, the young princess and Fertram passed through and turned their steps towards the unknown world lying beyond their own grounds. "That it was the only way, Fertram," said Hildur, when the young man regretted leaving without a word of thanks or love to those who had cared for him through the long years since his childhood. "It was the only way. Nowhere in my father's castle would you have been safe, and my grandmother would only have vented her anger upon my parents if they had known of our flight." At length a small river stopped their way. In an instant Hildur changed herself and Fertram into trout, and, glittering in the sunlight, they leaped into the water. Hardly had they got below the surface when they saw the grandmother walking along the bank of the river. She had tracked them at once, and now used her spells to try and catch them in their present form. The day wore on, but her art was useless. Nothing would entrap the wary trout, and at last, filled with rage, she retraced her steps to the castle. It was sunset now, and the two young people, having resumed their natural shape, pursued their way into the forest. "We must no longer take the form of fish," Hildur said. "Even now grandmother will be weaving a magic net, out of which no fish can possibly escape." And up in her tower the grandmother went on weaving. At first the work went smoothly, but soon the netting became entangled, the knots no longer held together, and her spells showed her that the fugitives were no longer fish, but had resumed their own forms. "Go forth immediately," she said to her servants. "Take every one who can be spared. Search all through the forest, and kill every living thing that you see." So the servants searched all day in every direction, but not a creature was to be seen. At last, as night drew on, they met two beautiful dogs. They were the most magnificent animals they had ever seen. But although they were quite friendly with the servants, they did not allow themselves to be touched. The men therefore returned to the castle and told what had happened. The wrath of the grandmother was terrible to see. She knew at once that the dogs were Fertram and Hildur, and she commanded the servants to be thrown into the dungeons for not carrying out her orders. Hildur, by her magic power, knew what had taken place. "We must not stay here, Fertram," she said sadly. "My grandmother will never rest now until she kills us. Even her love for me seems to have turned to hatred." "But what can we do?" Fertram asked. "Better let me go by myself out into the world, and do you return. Then all will be well." But Hildur made no answer. Presently she unfolded a square of green cloth. "Sit on this beside me," she said. In a moment they were floating high up in the air. The day wore on. Sometimes they were borne along swiftly by a strong breeze. Then a soft, gentle wind would come and seem almost to rock them to sleep, till just as the sun was setting and the sky was one blaze of gold and crimson, Hildur made the cloth descend slowly to the earth again, and they found themselves in a great flowery plain. Magnificent trees shaded it here and there. A beautiful river wound its way gently through luxuriant banks covered with ferns, and in the distance rose the tower of a great city, surmounted by a magnificent castle, standing out distinctly against the sky. "Fertram," Hildur said in a low voice, laying her hand on his arm, "this is your native land. You are the son of the king who once reigned here. Now he has been dead for some years. When you were only a year old, your mother carried you into the beautiful orchard which lies at the foot of the castle, when suddenly a great dragon swooped down, tore you from her arms, and she saw you no more. Your father grieved even more for you than your mother. You were his only child, and the loss preyed upon him, till at length he died of grief. The kingdom will soon have no ruler, for your mother, who hid her grief for your father's sake, is now pining away, and they fear for her life too. Now, Fertram, you must go to her, tell her your history, and receive the kingdom from her hands. Hildur, dear Hildur, can it be true? Have I really a mother of my own, as you have? It is almost too delightful to believe. Come, let us hasten to her," cried Fertram. "No," Hildur answered, "I must not go with you. You must go alone, but I will remain quietly in that small hut which is under the great tree yonder, until you come for me." "But, oh, Fertram," and she clasped his arm with her two white hands, "remember I am alone in a strange country. Do not forget me." "Forget you, when you have been everything to me all these years?" "Hildur, how could I? Such a thing could never happen. I love you better than myself." "Yes, I know," Hildur answered, "but I fear some evil. I know not what." Then, to prevent her grandmother's spells taking effect, she rubbed some salve out of a small box she carried over his hands and face, and bade him a sorrowful farewell. Fertram embraced her tenderly, laughed away her fears, and then took his way towards the town. He looked very handsome as he turned once more to wave his cap to her, and the sun's rays lit up his fair hair. She watched him until she could see him no longer, and then went on to the little hut she had destined for her temporary abode. Fertram only stopped once on his way to the city. Feeling tired with the long journey, he sat down under an oak tree on a grassy mound. While he was resting, a beautiful dog came up, and as he patted and stroked it, the dog licked his face and hands. Immediately Fertram forgot all his past life, and that Hildur was waiting for him in the hut under the trees. Having rested, he rose up and pursued his way into the town. "Can I see the queen?" he inquired. "I have news for her which will give her joy." At first no one paid any heed, but the youth's noble appearance struck the courtiers, and at length he was admitted into the palace. There he was brought before the queen, who was lying, pale and languid, on a great couch of rich silks and cloth of gold. When he bowed before her, she rose to a sitting position, startled out of her apathy and weakness by his likeness to the dead king. "Who is this youth? Where does he come from?" she asked. "Madam," the courtiers answered, "he is a stranger who craves admittance as a bearer of good tidings to your majesty." Then, in a few words, Fertram told his tale. Before it was done, he was clasped in the loving arms of his mother, who felt it was indeed her long-lost son. The court was summoned together to hear the glad tidings. The news was proclaimed in the streets of the city. The queen gave the government at once into the hands of her son, and the young king was crowned amid universal rejoicings. Day after day went by. Fertram was absorbed with the affairs of his kingdom and his love for his mother. All thought of Hildur had gone like a dream. One day the city was roused to great excitement by the appearance of a most beautiful maiden. No one knew whence she had come, but all agreed that her loveliness could not be surpassed. And when the queen saw her, she sent for her to the palace, treated her like a daughter, and besought Fertram to marry her. This, however, he steadily refused to do. After a time, whispers went abroad that the beautiful girl was not as good as she was lovely. Her fair face was constantly disfigured by an ugly frown if things were not arranged as she liked, and the courtiers began to think that the king was right, after all, in preferring to seek another wife. Just then one of the royal swineherds happened to lose his way in the forest, and he wandered on until he came to a little hut. There he found an old man and his wife, and with them a fair maiden whom they called their daughter. Never had the swineherd seen anyone so beautiful, and he determined to stay the night with these people, and if possible carry off the maiden. He found that her name was Hildur, and when the old people had gone up to bed, while Hildur was closing the windows and putting things straight before following their example, he suggested that they should go out and look at the beautiful moon rising. But Hildur said, "I must first make up the fire on the hearth." The man offered to do it for her, but no sooner had he knelt down than his hands became fastened to the hearth. In vain he struggled to get away. It was all of no avail. Hildur was nowhere to be seen, and it was not until morning that he felt free once more. Then, rising to his feet, he fled from the uncanny place without once looking back. When he reached the castle, his fellow servants soon heard the whole tale, and the report of the beauty of the woodcutter's daughter was circulated from one to the other. The royal huntsman thought he, too, would like to see her. So, setting off at once, he reached the hut and begged for a night's rest. The old people granted it willingly. The beautiful girl was still there, and the huntsman in his turn planned to carry her off that night. He begged Hildur to come for a walk, as it was such a beautiful night, but she refused. "My time is too fully occupied for idle wanderings," she said. "Will you help me by locking up the door for the night?" "Willingly," said the huntsman, intending to put the key in his pocket and carry her off later on. But no sooner had his hands touched the lock than they remained fastened to it. A mocking laugh behind him made him look round, and he saw Hildur disappearing up the stairs to her room. When the sun was well up in the sky, and the old couple beginning to stir, the huntsman found he could remove his hands, and he hurried off shamefaced to his home. Shortly after this, the king was out hunting in the forest, when suddenly a thick black fog enveloped everything. He lost his way hours. He arrived at a little hut, knocked joyfully at the door, and on its being opened by an old man, craved leave to rest. He was at once invited to enter, and then the old man, recognizing the king, begged him to excuse the poverty of the place. The king sat down, wearied with his long wandering, and the old man waited upon him, bringing food and drink of the best he had. Just as the meal was ended, Hildur came in, and the king thought he had never seen anyone so beautiful before. She was dressed as a simple peasant, but she looked like a royal princess. The king begged leave to stay the night, as it was still too foggy for him to find his way, and the old man acceded, only apologizing for the poorness of the accommodation. "I will not disturb you," the king said. "Let me only rest in this room for the night, as I have been doing now." So it was arranged. After the old couple had gone to bed, the king begged Hildur to stay and talk with him, but she said she must see to the calves in the stable. "That I can do for you," he answered, and rising, he went out into the stable, put the straw and hay right for the calves, and had made everything tidy, when one of them got out. After great trouble he caught hold of it by the tail, but alas! His hands remained fastened to it, and he was found in this plight by Hildur just before dawn. She laughed merrily when she saw him. "It hardly suits a king, my lord," she said, "to be hanging on to the tail of a calf." But Fertram humbly begged her to release him. As she did so, she looked up at him. "Do you not recognize me?" she said. "No," replied Fertram, much astonished. "I have never seen you before, I am certain." "Perhaps, then, I remind you of someone?" she asked again. "Of Hildur, the king's daughter who brought you back to your kingdom." "No," he said again, more puzzled still. "I never even remember hearing the name of Hildur." Then Hildur went and fetched the little box of ointment, and directly she rubbed it on his hands and face, his past life came back to him. He embraced Hildur again and again, thanking her for all she had done for him, and asking her to forgive his apparent coldness and forgetfulness. "You, and you alone, have had my love all this time, at any rate," he said, "for I could love no one else. And you alone shall be my queen." Sitting down together in the early morning sunshine under one of the great forest trees, Hildur told him what he did not know, namely, that the beautiful girl whom his mother had taken into the palace was really her old grandmother. She had followed them and transformed herself so that Fertram should marry her. Then she meant to kill him and his mother and seize the kingdom. "So far I have guarded you from her wicked schemes," Hildur said, laying her hand on his. "But knowing that the past was no longer in your mind, I have feared each day that she might succeed in winning you. For had you been unfaithful to me, I could no longer have done anything for you against her wiles." Again and again Fertram thanked her, then he bade her a tender farewell and went straight back to the city. The great council of the kingdom was summoned, and to them the young king disclosed the real history of the wicked grandmother. But she was too cunning to be caught and punished. Divining what had happened, she disappeared amid a cloud of fire and smoke. Then Fertram, accompanied by a magnificent retinue with glittering dresses, splendid horses, and all the nobles of the kingdom, went to fetch his bride. She was still in her simple peasant's dress, but her beauty made all forget what she wore. Mounting the beautiful steed brought for her, she rode back beside Fertram to the palace, and on the steps, waiting to receive her, was Fertram's mother. This was indeed a joyful day for her. The wish of her heart was granted in the loveliness and goodness of her son's bride. The wedding was celebrated with the utmost pomp and magnificence, and Fertram and Hildur lived happily together, surrounded, as years passed on, by their beautiful children and grandchildren.